Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Sears. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How about you?
I'm well, thank you, sir. Can you see me and hear me okay?
I can see you and I can hear you clearly.
Beautiful.
Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
All right, sir. I think we're all set, but I'll be here if you need anything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
and I'll come in.
Good morning, everyone. Before this hearing begins, I'd like to pass along some notes about the system we are using today. This hearing will be broadcast live on the House Budget Committee website. Each participant has a control bar at the bottom of their screen that includes a mute button and a video on/off button. The view control buttons in the upper right of your screen control your personal view and can be switched between active speaker and gallery view. This is your individual view and will not affect anyone else or what the public sees during the proceeding. We ask that you please leave your screen in gallery view throughout the hearing so you can see the timer, witnesses, and your fellow members. Please note that the timer is its own square and will only be visible if you are in gallery view. It will remain there throughout the event. All participants are automatically muted upon entry to the hearing. In a moment, I will mute any participants who have taken themselves off mute. All participants are asked to keep themselves muted when not actively engaging in the discussion, which should help limit echoes or other disruptions. In instances in which members yield back or otherwise conclude their turn speaking but do not remember to remute themselves, I will do so to limit inadvertent background audio. Members and witnesses are responsible for unmuting themselves anytime they wish to be heard. With that, Chairman Yarmouth, we are ready to begin.
Thank you, Ally. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on the Department of Defense's fiscal year 2023 budget. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, so ordered. I'll start by going over a few housekeeping matters. The committee is holding a hybrid hearing. Members may participate remotely or in person. For individuals participating remotely, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute a participant's microphone when the participant is not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. If you are participating remotely and are experiencing connectivity issues, please contact staff immediately so those issues can be resolved. Members participating in the hearing room or on the remote platform are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If you are participating remotely and I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. I'd like to remind members participating remotely in this proceeding to keep your camera on at all times, even if you are not under recognition by the chair. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. If you are on the remote platform and choose to participate in a different proceeding, please turn your camera off. Finally, we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to everyone's staff. Now I will introduce our witness. This morning, we will be hearing from the Honorable Michael J. McCord, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller and Chief Financial Officer at the U.S. Department of Defense. Welcome, Undersecretary. I now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome back Undersecretary Michael McCord to our committee. Thank you for joining us today for this hearing on the Department of Defense fiscal year 2023 budget. As the first person to be Comptroller at DoD twice, and with your decades-long career of service, including time on the staff of the House Budget Committee, your insights are particularly helpful to the work of the committee. I would like to begin this hearing by acknowledging our deep and enduring gratitude to those who serve our nation in uniform. We understand that Congress has a constitutional and moral responsibility to ensure that our service members are supported on and off the battlefield and that their families are cared for every step of the way. That is why the Biden budget provides members of our military with the largest pay increase in a generation. It funds a newly authorized basic needs allowance. It invests $12.2 billion to build more housing and medical facilities for military families, and it prioritizes programs that directly support military spouses, children, and other dependents. And it dedicates nearly $500 million to fully fund and implement vital programs to prevent and respond to sexual assault in the military. The Biden budget also ensures that the Department of Defense has the resources necessary to uphold our national security and protect our people at home and abroad. It does not aimlessly increase spending for its own sake without accountability or strategic rationale. It provides the smart investments that will make our country safer and meet the requests of the experts in charge. This budget is also forward-looking. It provides more than $130 billion for research and development to harness next-generation defense capabilities, the largest request on record. It invests in new technologies and includes $3.1 billion in funding to combat the destabilizing effects of the climate crisis and ensure our military installations are resilient against climate disasters. This is critical to our national defense. In a 2019 report, the Pentagon found that 46 of our nation's 79 high-priority military installations are vulnerable to climate change-related flooding, drought, desertification, and wildfires. President Biden also recognizes that ensuring America's national security extends far beyond our efforts to build weapons and military might. It is also about leveraging our power through diplomacy and deterrence. While these investments are not directly part of DoD's budget, they are a crucial part of the President's overall national defense strategy, and rightly so. As General James Mattis said in response to former President Trump's budget that slashed funding for the State Department, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." He was President Trump's Secretary of Defense when he said that. And I would add that we don't just save money by investing in diplomacy. We save lives by keeping members of our armed forces out of harm's way. This is a whole-of-government approach to national security. It's a budget that increases funding for the State Department and includes vital investments to strengthen NATO and support our European allies in the face of Russian aggression, to advance cybersecurity, and to maintain strong and credible deterrence. On all counts, President Biden's budget reflects the much-needed return of U.S. global leadership, a commitment not only to our democratic allies, but the democratic values our nation was founded upon, and the assurance that no dictator will have a foothold in this White House. Finally, let me stress again that this budget meets the needs articulated by the experts in charge of our national defense. If your argument is that we should fund the military at a level higher than Pentagon leaders say they need, then you have the burden of making the case that the world's most renowned defense experts are inept or intentionally undercutting our military. I don't think anyone here today can come close to making that point. To close, I'll quote Defense Secretary Austin. He said, and I quote, "We need resources matched to strategy, strategy matched to policy, and policy matched to the will of the American people. This budget gives us the resources we need to deliver on that promise." Undersecretary McCord, I look forward to hearing how the budget accomplishes this. I thank you again for your testimony and for appearing before our committee today. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Undersecretary McCord. Thank you for being here today. The last time you were here, America was facing a number of crises at the border, at the checkout line, at the gas pump, and Republicans warned that the agenda President Biden was pursuing would only make these crises worse. Sadly, it turns out that we were right. Prices have spiked to the highest level in 40 years, 10.4% of an increase since Joe Biden took the oath of office. The cost of gas is through the roof, increase of 88.9% since Joe Biden took the oath of office. We have seen 2.9 million encounters at the southern border since Biden took office. These crises did not happen overnight or when Putin invaded Ukraine, as the White House is fond of arguing. They are the direct result of the policies being pursued by this administration. This year's budget from President Biden promotes the same failed policies, and the defense budget is not immune from the administration's misplaced priorities. At a time when inflation is 8.5%, 10.4% since Joe Biden took the oath of office, robbing the wallets of American families and eroding the purchasing power of federal agencies. It's critical that tax dollars go to their best possible use, but the president's defense budget does not do that. For example, the defense budget dedicates $3.1 billion to climate projects. Europe is experiencing the largest land invasion since World War II. President Biden executed a horrific withdrawal from Afghanistan that cost Americans lives, including a Missourian, and embolden our enemies. China has an aggressive eye focused on Taiwan. Iran continues its march toward a nuclear weapon, but the president wants to spend finite taxpayer resources for butterflies and snakes. The request for Iron Dome funding is the bare minimum and 92% lower than what Congress just agreed to spend to support our ally, Israel. The only mention of Iron Dome in the budget is buried in an appendix. Meanwhile, the president wants to spend $34 million to address extremism in the military. If we're going to talk about extremism, let's talk about the 42 individuals on the terror watch list that have been apprehended at our southern border since President Biden took office. With the president set to end Title 42 border policy, and likely it will double to 18,000, the number of illegal immigrants trying to cross the border every day, I hope our military leaders are talking to the president about how this is not just an immigration problem, it's a national security crisis. We know DHS will need to continue calling DOD for help. That's going to impact the military's bottom line, while at the same time, the president in his budget is telling our military to be sure it funds implementation of a DOD report on equity. These are funds that will not be used to arm and protect our men and women in uniform. Given these circumstances, we must have as much transparency on the part of DOD and the administration about where funds are going and how they are being spent. We need accounting of resources like those left behind in Afghanistan that are now arming the Taliban. We need the Biden administration to maintain the commitment we saw under President Trump to have the Defense Department conduct an audit so that Congress and the American people know how and where tax dollars are being spent, so we can ensure resources are getting to the places they are needed the most. The national security threats at our border and around the world, the highest spike in prices in 40 years, skyrocketing energy cost, President Biden may see these as an inconvenient political problem, but American families, they see them as a crisis. I fear our enemies will see them as weakness. We need a budget that takes these problems seriously. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his opening remarks. In the interest of time, I ask that any other members who wish to make a statement submit their written statements for the record to the email inbox we established for receiving documents before and during committee proceedings. Once again, we've distributed that email address to the staffs. I will hold the record open until the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I want to thank Undersecretary McCord for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the President's FY23 budget request for the Department of Defense. First, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your service to the people of Kentucky and the House and your country, and wish you all the best as you prepare to retire at the end of this Congress. It's a pleasure to be here. Nearly 20 years since I served on the staff of this committee in a very luxurious cubicle in the basement of this building, alongside your staff director and 3 other colleagues who remain on the committee staff today from that time. I appreciate the key role this committee plays in addressing our nation's priorities. Last month, President Biden released his FY23 budget request, as you know, which includes $773 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Defense, which is a 4% increase over the FY22 enacted amount and an 8% increase over what we requested last year. This represents the largest budget request ever in nominal terms in the history of the department. Our request for the entire national defense function for FY23 totals $813.4 billion in discretionary funding and $827 billion for the function when mandatory spending is included. Given the size and scope of our department with 3 million employees, $3 trillion in assets and worldwide missions, it's hard to summarize our goals and programs and operations briefly, but I want to highlight a few key items from our budget. Our budget was submitted to Congress alongside our new national defense strategy, which was designed to fill Secretary Austin's direction to match resource strategy and strategy to policy. In both the strategy and the budget, we prioritize China as our long-term pacing challenge, but we recognize Russia as an acute and dangerous threat to our interests as well. The budget advances our goal through three primary channels, which you may have heard the Secretary describe: integrated deterrence, campaigning, and actions to build enduring advantages. These three approaches are at the heart of the strategy and the organizing framework for our budget. First, integrated deterrence entails developing and combining the strengths that we have for maximum effect by working across different warfighting domains, different geographic regions, different spectrums of conflict, with our other agencies, other instruments of national power, and our network of allies and partners. Campaigning is something that's more done by combatant commanders. It means well-planned, well-sequenced activities and initiatives around the world that are meant to advance our priorities and gain us advantage over our competitors. For example, most notably, there's a Pacific Deterrence Initiative and a European Deterrence Initiative that I think are well-known to members. Those are probably the two best examples of that. The third axis of our strategy is to build enduring advantages, and this is investments in policies that make our institutions stronger and capable for the long haul. So this is both our own people, primarily our own people, but also our industrially-based partners to make them more agile and resilient. Chairman, you mentioned some of the things focused on our own people, the basic needs allowance, which we're rolling out on based on the NDAA, and also the 4.6% pay raise for military and civilians, and implementation of the $15 minimum wage for our federal employees and federal contractors contained in the President's executive order. In the budget and in our programs, our focus was on enhancing our capabilities in ways that would make the most difference, first and foremost against China, but also against Russia. While China is our largest challenger across the military, diplomatic, and economic dimensions, I want to be clear that many of the high-priority investments in this budget do not fall neatly into a China-only box or a Russia-only box. Virtually all of our most important investments help us on both fronts, starting with the modernization of our nuclear triad, and also our investments in a more distributed and resilient space architecture that recognizes that space is no longer a sanctuary to operate in. Likewise, our investments in cyber capability and the quality of our service members, in submarines, in our industrial base, are all examples of capabilities we need to build to keep strong for all the challenges we face. And that's the logic of the idea of building and maintaining enduring advantages. Let me give one particular example of that. We have $3 billion in this budget for microelectronics, both in terms of lifetime buy procurement of chips that exist today and in research. This funding is meant to be complementary to the CHIPS Act, which we hope to see Congress pass soon. I also want to highlight in this budget, some of which you touched on, Chairman, to implement both the recommendations of our own independent review, Commission on Countering Sexual Assault, and the landmark changes in military justice in this area enacted in last year's Defense Authorization Bill. Due to the lengthy CR, we were not able to move out as quickly as we wanted to last year because it was a new start activity, but we are moving to accelerate and catch up into FY23 in this budget on this issue. Finally, I just want to highlight there's $1 billion in this budget to respond to the fuel spill at a Red Hill facility in Hawaii, and that's a strong sign of this administration's commitment to do the right thing both by our own people in Hawaii and our neighbors in Honolulu. As Secretary Austin announced last month, we plan to shut this facility down and disperse our fuel operations in the region going forward. Let me also say a word about inflation. When we saw prices changing last year, we took all the information that we could gather up to the time we finished the budget late in the calendar year and built that into our FY23 pricing. We worked with OMB to add about $20 billion a year to this program from 23 through 27 to reflect higher inflation for goods and services and the increased compensation costs for our own service members. In terms of a general inflation rate, I know a lot of people focus on this consumer price index. That's not what we use at DoD. We use the chain-weighted price index for the GDP deflator, which is required by law, first of all, but also more reflective of what we buy. We also use a number of specific price indices for fuel, for housing costs, for our health care. As you know, prices have continued to evolve since we finalized our budget. We recognize the impact of global economic conditions on our ability to deliver the capabilities in this budget, and we're prepared to work with Congress to find the best solutions to address these challenges as we move forward toward the congressional oversight of this budget. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, the people of our department are working hard every day to protect and advance our security and advance the security of our allies and partners. We're doing everything we can to assist the people of Ukraine in their struggle against Russian aggression, which we could not do without your strong support in Congress. I'm ready to discuss that issue further during our session today. Along the lines of the whole of government approach that you mentioned, our department is ready to serve as an important instrument of national power whenever called on, and sometimes in ways that are not particularly visible to the American people. For example, we played an important support role in the effort to control the COVID-19 pandemic, using our contracting and logistics capabilities to award over $30 billion of contracts for vaccines and deliver 297 million syringes to put shots in arms on behalf of HHS. Likewise, working with HHS and AID, we've awarded $7 billion in contracts to procure 1 billion doses of vaccine for global distribution. So this is not something we're doing with our defense budget, but doing with our capabilities to help out our interagency partners. Our budget is grounded in our strategy, and our primary focus is on increasing our capability to make our force better, not to make it a larger force. Given the security challenges we face, I urge the committee to fully support the President's budget request for national defense. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions about this budget.
Thank you very much for your statement. I figured I'd give you the liberty of couple more minutes since we're talking about an awful lot of money. We'll now begin our question and answer session. As a reminder, members can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them electronically to the email inbox we've established within 7 days of the hearing. As is my habit, I will defer my questioning to the end, so I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary McCord, for being here today. I just want to focus on the issue of America and the rest of the world's addiction to Russian oil and refined petroleum products. The world gives Vladimir Putin $1 billion every single day for the gas and oil that Russia provides to European Union countries, to the United States, and to Germany. Our addiction to oil has weaponized the war in Ukraine and to take advantage of the fact that the United States is not energy independent. In fact, according to the Energy Information Agency, last year, the United States imported 672,000 barrels every single day, or 22 million barrels a month, of Russian crude oil and refined petroleum products. We just spent $6 trillion in 3 Middle East wars, primarily because of our addiction to their oil. Despite what we say, we are not energy independent. Today, in the world, there are 211 lithium-ion battery factories. Batteries make up 30 to 40% of the entire cost of an electric vehicle. 211 lithium-ion batteries worldwide. 156 are in China. 22 are in Europe, and 12 are in the United States. Americans, 75% say they want an electric vehicle. 50% are reluctant to purchase of an electric vehicle because of lack of confidence about charging infrastructure. So how does the Department of Defense assess the importance of developing electric vehicles to become energy independent and to combat climate change and to our national defense strategy?
Excuse me, thank you. Probably the primary area where we feel like we can make a difference more quickly is on vehicles, on vehicles and aircraft, as you say. Aircraft are what consume most of our energy in the Defense Department, and we do have some programs that are going to take longer to deliver, something called the blended wing body, which is something that will benefit both our longer range aircraft like a tanker, but also of interest on the commercial side, so hopefully a win-win for the department and the private sector. On the climate side in the department, one of the key factors that we thought about here in this past year building this budget was trying to, as you say, look at where the market is moving so that we are not wedding ourselves to technology that industry is not going to be producing in a few years, so that we are not in the situation we are in with something like a submarine where we're buying something, we're the only one who buys something. So we are looking for wins that will keep us in sync with the market, that will reduce our logistic tail. It's something you look at today in Russia, Ukraine. The Russians are suffering greatly by their poor logistics. This is something, not to say that their capabilities are anywhere near ours, but this is a situation you don't want to be in where you're tied down by your logistics
Well,
strain. So
let
we're
me say
looking to
this.
make ourselves more agile as well as market-friendly with these investments.
Without Russian oil and gas exports, the Putin regime would collapse. It is estimated that 300,000 young people under the age of 40 that are tech savvy. Russia produces more software engineers than any country in the world and twice that of the United States. The problem for Russia is it's an economy that's shrinking, its population is shrinking, and all the people that are leaving are the young people that are looking for a better way of life somewhere else. So when you look at, 35 to 40% of the entire economy is gas and oil, and we and in Western Europe are addicted to that gas and oil, that empowers Putin. Then he steals the money from the Russian people, gives it to oligarchs, that puts that money in rule of law nations. So it's harder to sanction those monies because in rule of law nations, people that have money have rights. So it just seems to me that this all comes down to the very same conclusion. We are stuck in a bad situation, not entirely, but primarily because we and the rest of the world are addicted to oil and gas that Vladimir Putin drills into the ground, doesn't diversify his economy, people don't have rights, the Russian economy is tanking, and that economy and that country is getting older and poorer because all the young people are leaving. Now maybe the silver lining here is that they'll come to the United States and use their skills that they can't, realize their full potential in a country like Russia. So thank you for being here.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now I yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, President Biden's defense budget spends $3.1 billion on climate programs. It's 5 times more than the administration requested last year. How does the administration justify funneling billions of dollars to the Green New Deal agenda rather than protecting our men and women in uniform?
Mr. Smith, we feel that these investments are things primarily that we need to happen anyway. We're always going to invest in our facilities. We're always going to invest in some kind of vehicle, some kind of aircraft. So we're trying to have them be ones that are going to move us in the right direction to reduce our dependence on logistic trains when we're moving. On the tactical side, on the non-tactical side, normal vehicles that are moved around for other things. Again, we're trying to be where the market is so that we're investing in vehicles and batteries that industry is going to be producing. So we don't feel that it's an either or that is taking away from things that we would be otherwise needed. We're always going to invest in vehicles, always going to invest in our facilities.
You have a funding stream in here to implement a DoD equity report. You also include $34 million for DoD to address extremism within the ranks. DoD has identified fewer than 100 instances of confirmed extremist activity in 2021, and investigators have turned up no more than a handful of so-called extremists within a military of 2.1 million people. Why does the administration believe our military is full of extremists? Or is this just furthering a narrative of political convenience?
Mr. Smith, I think the Secretary does not believe, and I'm sure he's convinced that our military is not full of extremists. He is concerned that one is too many, and therefore that he feels strongly about the need for both to address extremism and prevent it from being an issue in our force, but also on the broader issue of diversity. As he well knows, our military, as you know, is very diverse. But when you get to the top, the leadership looks less diverse and looks less like the force that it leads. And so he is concerned about both of these things as making the team as strong as possible, that it be a diverse team from the bottom to the top, and that extremism, while rare, is very divisive and corrosive of good order and discipline.
For $34 million, the military could purchase over 100 tactical vehicles. It could purchase a couple of additional Abrams tanks, items far more beneficial to our troops in the field and to the success of their missions. What exactly are you planning to spend this $34 million on?
Mr. Smith, I would have to get you the details for the record of down below line, at line.
I definitely would love the details, and so would the American people. Well, it seems this idea that the military has somehow been infiltrated by extremists, white nationalists, and neo-Nazi sympathizers won't go away, because just this week, the Democrats, they had planned to move a bill calling for investigations into the military and law enforcement for terrorist activity, something I find deeply offensive. When you testified last year, I asked you about the cost of the president's decision to cancel the border wall. We have estimates that the government is spending $6 million per day to DoD contractors to essentially babysit $350 million in unused border wall material. We sent you a letter as well, to which we've yet to hear back. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the letter for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much funding has DoD spent on litigation and settling disputes related to contracts for the border wall?
Mr. Smith, we can get you that for the record. I don't believe that the total will be very high because, of course, on litigation, we
If you can get me that, we've been asking for a year. I would appreciate that, and I love that you said that here in committee. How many border wall contracts has DoD canceled since the start of the Biden administration?
I don't have that number at my fingertips. I don't believe the number of contracts was large. The dollar amount may have been larger, but I don't think there were that many different
Can you give us that information?
the number of contracts.
Hopefully in a timely fashion too. And how much more of DoD funds does the administration intend to spend on settling these contracts?
I'm not aware that we've spent anything to settle yet, but
How much are you intending to set aside to settle?
we don't have funds set aside for border wall litigation in the.
So you won't be able to settle any contracts if you have no money set aside?
Well, we, the Department of Defense, would work in concert with the Department of Justice, who is always the lead for litigation for
As soon as you have any settlements, I would love to have that information, and I think the Budget Committee members would love that as well. We know DHS has had to request assistance from DoD to aid in dealing with the border crisis. Does DoD support the president's plan to lift the Title 42 border policy and double the number of illegal immigrants, roughly 18,000 folks attempting to enter the U.S. each day?
I don't know that the Department of Defense was asked or has provided a view on that policy matter. I will say on support to the border, that is something that has occurred every year that I've been associated with the department. So for at least a dozen years in a row, the Department of Homeland Security asks us to provide security. I think many members are familiar with. We're not directly in contact with illegal immigrants, but we are on the intelligence side and the support side. That would be continuing this year. The Secretary has already responded to Secretary Mayorkas's request that we be prepared to provide support again this year.
Is DoD planning for the contingency that it will have to fund some sort of effort to assist DHS with the border crisis? And how much of its budget does DoD believe will need to be allocated to assist DHS?
In recent years, the average has been about 0.1%, about $500 or $600 million a year is the bill that we have tended to run up each year in providing support to the border wall.
Okay.
I'm sorry, support on the border, not to the border wall, excuse me.
Last year, I asked you about what areas of the defense budget are impacted the most by increases in inflation. You said probably the thing that we noticed the most rapidly in the Defense Department is when fuel prices change because we're such a large consumer of fuel. We have seen a dramatic rise in fuel prices since President Biden took office. In fact, 88.9% increase. How have these higher fuel prices affected DoD?
What we discussed last year is still the case today, that fuel is our most volatile and easily recognizable price increase when prices change. This year, in FY22, we have already seen a fuel price increase in the first couple of months of $1.5 billion. That cost increase was made known to the appropriations committees who provided funding for that in the omnibus appropriations bill that was signed 6 weeks ago.
Wow.
Since that time, largely due to the price spike after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we estimate a bill of $1.8 billion for the rest of this fiscal year. So over $3 billion across the course of this fiscal year in increased fuel prices if the situation remains as we see it today.
Wow, $3 billion is a lot. And, in fact, in an exchange between Chairman Yarmouth and the OMB Director, Shalonda Young, last month, they suggested that since DOD can lock in prices in advance with contracts, DOD's budget is not particularly impacted by inflationary increases or fuel cost. Do you agree with Chairman and Director Young, or do you disagree and see that as a real concern? $3 billion seems like a real concern.
Mr. Smith, we do have contracts, but we are, although we are a very large consumer of fuel, we are still at the 1% level in terms of the fuel market.
But it's a concern.
We cannot move the markets ourselves, and we don't have an ability to buy long-term contracts that completely insulate us from. We do buy by contract, but they only go so far out.
So the president's budget proposes the bare minimum of funding for the Iron Dome defense system for our ally Israel. The funding level is 92% less than what was recently adopted in the bipartisan fashion by Congress. The administration also buries any mention of Iron Dome in an appendix to the budget. Does DOD believe the bare minimum of funding is enough to support Israel? And what support of signal does that send to our ally Israel and to Israel's enemies about U.S.'s commitments when it's obvious Iran is charging full speed ahead to a nuclear weapon?
I would say the department has a pretty long history of cooperative programs with Israel, including Arrow and David Sling. The Iron Dome funding last year, of course, was a spike because of the rocket attacks, and the request from the government of Israel for $1 billion was over and above the normal support. So we are continuing the normal support, but we don't have anything. That was a one-time $1 billion last year request from Israel based on this specific incident.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your service and your testimony. This budget request unifies the Army's modernization strategy under the Army Futures Command, which is based in Austin, Texas, with almost an additional $1 billion over the current budget. And after a year that Army Futures has described as a standout year. So I'm pleased to see that provision, though I remain concerned that a permanent commanding general has not yet been submitted to the Senate. Particularly important in the cooperation with Army Futures Command, which is so unique, is the involvement and engagement with the private sector, with the University of Texas on trauma care, which promises great benefits to the civilian sector as well, and the work with Austin Community College in opening the doors on an Army software factory. So I'm very pleased to see that is happening. I'm a little amazed, but perhaps those who view the events that occurred here that culminated with the attempt to overthrow the government on January the 6th dismiss the need to focus on domestic extremism. I think all those who don't believe in the fantasy that this was a legitimate political discourse would have to applaud the portion of this budget that's allocated to concerns about domestic extremism. Likewise, I find the ranking member's criticism of the portion of this budget allocated to addressing the existential challenge of the climate crisis, I think they would be shocking were they not repeated so frequently. The climate crisis is one of our most serious national security challenges, as not only this budget, but one former national security leader after another, people like Admiral Dennis Blair, have recognized that we need to be dealing with this and that we are already facing the dangers to our families of not addressing the climate crisis. So I think the real danger to our families, security-wise, is not from this budget, but from those who continue to be climate deniers. Finally, Mr. McCord, as far as Ukraine is concerned, our most immediate issue right now, it's very encouraging to see what happened with the secretaries going to Kyiv this week and with the developments yesterday, the fact that this administration doesn't take a go-it-alone approach, but is uniting both NATO and countries outside of NATO to help. Can you outline for us basically what this budget is doing concerning our ongoing commitment to give the Ukrainians everything that they need to defend their freedom and prevent advances beyond Ukraine by Russian atrocities in Moldova or elsewhere?
Thank you, Mr. Doggett. Our budget per se for '23 was built before, it was finalized before the invasion occurred. So there's not a direct straight line from invasion, therefore the budget does X, Y, Z. What I will say is that for '22, we had a supplemental attached to the omnibus appropriation bill with strong support for both the state and the DoD sides of support to Ukraine. We have, as of the end of this week, we will have pretty much used all of that, the drawdown and Ukraine Security Initiative funding. We anticipate sending an additional supplemental to Congress this week to continue to message that we are in this with the Ukrainians, we and our partners, to make sure that they have what they need to continue their fight against Russian aggression. So for '23, we're going to be reviewing this summer to what extent our posture in Europe should change. And then there's a lot of variables there. It may seem obvious that the answer would be we're going to have more troops stationed in Europe, but given that Russia may emerge weaker, there needs to be some analysis before we jump to that conclusion. We will be doing that analysis this summer. I think that we will be able to, after the NATO summit this summer, and after that analysis, we'll be able to come back to Congress and say, what do we think needs to happen in Europe for our own posture is the U.S. anchor of NATO, in addition then to what is the nature of the conflict? Is it over? Is it turned into a frozen conflict? Is it still an active conflict? But I anticipate that we will be continuing to stand with the Ukrainians, and if we need to ask for additional funding in '23, specifically to assist the Ukrainians, I would anticipate that the Secretary will be back before Congress to talk about that. But the budget itself continues the underlying framework of European Deterrence Initiative, and we look forward to seeing how we can strengthen that in concert with our allies at the NATO summit this summer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McCord, for being here today. The Biden budget includes several misplaced priorities while it fails to fund programs critical to national security. The budget does not fund American Air Power. The Air Force would be forced to cut 150 aircraft, including 21 A-10s, 33 F-22 Raptors, 50 T-1 Jayhawks, and 13 KC-135 refuelers. The Air Force would also cut 15 F-35 jets compared to last year's budget request. The Army troop levels, if enacted, this budget, would result in the smallest Army we've had since World War II. Navy ships. The Navy ships, we would reduce our total fleet by 24 to 280. China, meanwhile, is continuing to have more ships, and we say we need 350 ships. Not to mention, we have sent numerous supplies to Ukraine, whether that be Javelin missiles or launchers, whether that be Stingers or Stinger armaments, S-300, artillery, small arms, or is anything in this budget replacing or replenishing our ammunition that we will need to fight tomorrow should the need arise? We cannot fight with weapon systems or ammunition that is produced in the future. We have to fight with what we have in stock on day. So all that being said, my first question is there are a lot of different numbers and percentages being thrown around regarding the defense budget. The administration is claiming this request is an increase, a 9.8% increase for DOD to be exact. But just to be clear, this is compared to FY21, not FY22. Is that correct? Which is only a 2.2% increase.
You're correct that the two-year increase was 10%, and the reason that we mentioned that was that up until the time we were finishing, it wasn't clear what was going to happen with FY22, so it was a good way to sort of anchor from 21 to 23 before we knew where 22 was going to come out.
Now, refresh my memory, this is also based on a 2% inflation rate, which we know is greater than 8%. Is that correct, this budget?
Our budget is a real increase with the inflation rate that's in our budget. Obviously, inflation continues to evolve, and the numbers will be known for good a year and a half from now when FY23 inflation is a fact as opposed to a projection.
But it's an 8% inflation rate now over last year, not a 2% inflation rate.
Not in terms of the deflators that we use, in terms of the CPI.
Let me get to the next point. But even at a 2.2% increase over last year's budget, even the 2% number you gave last year means defense spending is flat this year under the Biden budget.
Again, our budget is a real increase over both the enacted and the requested last year, but the exact numbers will be fluctuating as if inflation continues to be dynamic as it is right now.
And it continues to have $3.1 billion on climate programs. Is that correct?
That is the figure that we have in the budget. That's
And
correct.
I haven't seen any electric tanks or electric vehicles operating in the Ukraine theater. Have you?
No, and tanks are not a primary lever that we're trying to electrify.
Are the cuts to the Air Force fighter procurement, total Navy ships, Army troop levels due to the administration's insistence that we can spend more money on green policies? If not, can you tell me why we're cutting ships, airplanes, and troops?
Yes, thank you for that question. I realize this is an issue that the committees are going to grapple with as they go through their markups on the Armed Services Committee where you sit and elsewhere in the appropriations process. The primary rationale for some of these reductions is that we're trying to divest ourselves of older, less capable systems that we don't think are going to cut it in a high-end fight with China if it comes to that. So that the ships, in particular the older LCS, are just not that capable. The A-10s are good airplanes.
Okay, let me real quick, because I only have time for one more question. And I'm sorry, I want the rest of your answer, but I need to ask this one more question. Of the unfunded requirements list, the UFERs, that every year we want to fill, those are things that we need that we don't have funds for. How many of those could be funded with the $3.1 billion in green climate stuff?
I believe the total of all the combatant commander chief unfunded lists are much higher than $3 billion. So yes, you could use the $3 billion in another way if the committee's.
With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now you have 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, as the Chief Financial Officer, I'm sure that you're aware of the recent report including findings from the Department of Defense Inspector General that highlighted what I would say is the broken and wasteful sole source contracting and spare parts equipment system, acquisition system. The Pentagon and the American taxpayers, I think, are really getting ripped off by many of these contracts. Some of those contractors have raised prices on essential items to the tune of more than 3,000%. In 2021, officials said that the U.S. Air Force paid a price of $10,000 to replace toilet seat covers. Now, I go way back to a time when we talked about $1,000 toilet seats and for a military cargo plane. And I ask unanimous consent to put into the record this article, the Air Force's $10,000 toilet cover.
Without objection.
And it seems to me that many of these small but vital parts and components are necessary, but because they can often be labeled commercial items, that contractors can refuse to provide the information that is, and the cost information, and prevents us from actually getting the best price. So I know that the department itself at one point in 2012 said that there ought to be legislation that would reform the contracting process and lower the prices. So I wanted to know what you would say about these excessive prices that the contractors are charging.
Thank you for that question. I would say I'm not familiar with the Air Force particular contract that you're citing, but I would say in general, you are correct that we have a different standard for commercial items than we do for non-commercial items, and that's a judgment that the department and the committee.
Well, does that mean that we have a harder time doing negotiations for a lower price?
Well, for a commercial item, yes, you're not supposed to be spending the same amount of time negotiating or doing contract auditing on the back end, and that's a trade-off that everybody has to make a judgment on as to whether, if every commercial item went through the same scrutiny as a submarine, then you would have, you'd need a lot more contract auditors, you'd have additional costs and time spent. So that's, again, a trade-off that we've collectively have made, that commercial items should live by a different standard, so that because we often hear it's too hard to do business with the department for smaller firms.
Well, let me just say, though, that the Department of Defense apparently found that if you just use, that there's a way to produce the same thing for $300 instead of $10,000, it seems it might be worth checking out whether some of these commercial things are worth it.
Agree.
Well, so tell me, how are we going to do something about addressing this problem of contractors who may be gouging taxpayers and the Department of Defense?
Well, in terms of entering into the contract itself, of course, that would be the responsibility of contracting officers on the acquisition side of the department. I'm not an acquisition official myself, but there is another line of defense, if you will, in the contracting officers themselves deciding what to purchase and how they go about entering into those contracts. But for the contract audit piece that does report to me, again, we do have a different standard for commercial items.
Aside from the issue of commercial items, the report that was made said that we are paying up to 3,000 times more for items from contractors. As the chief financial officer, don't you think this is something that we have to really look into?
I would agree that our pricing should be looked at, and as you know, of course, there have been pricing increases due to the supply chain problems of the last year or two, and I don't know if the date of time period that your report is focusing on, if it's during that supply chain issue or before. But yes, I agree that contract pricing is important.
Okay, this was done by the DOD Inspector General, so this is not my report. This is the DOD Inspector General, and I hope you'll look into it, because we shouldn't be paying these exorbitant prices, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
First of all, I couldn't agree more with Ms. Shankowski's line of questioning. I'm not as interested in whether we're spending more or less on the military this year as I am concerned about whether we're getting more or less for what we're spending. I happen to agree with Ronald Reagan that defense is not a budget issue. You spend what you need to spend in order to protect the country. But as was pointed out in a recent article in The Hill by Ben Freeman and William Hartung, they noted that the budget would give the Pentagon more money by far than at any time during the heights of the Korean War, Vietnam War, or Cold War, even when accounting for inflation. Despite this historically high level of Pentagon spending, the military has been shrinking. They point out that since 1985, our Navy fleet shrunk from 571 to 298 ships. Our Air Force has declined from 10,458 planes to 5,217. And our military force has shrunk from 2.1 million active duty personnel to just under 1.4 million. They go on to write, well, some might argue that while quantities of military equipment are down, quality has gone up. But it's precisely the most advanced weapons programs that have proven to be the biggest budget blunders. China's spending, according to independent analyses, about $250 billion a year on its military. That's less than a third of what the administration proposes, and yet China seems to be massively outbuilding us in terms of ships, weapon systems. Their armed force is twice the size of ours. What are you doing about this? Or as the millennials would say, WTF.
Mr. McClintock, And this is the same subject I think Mr. Kelly was touching on quality versus quantity. We do judge that, for example, the Army decided that the numbers were telling them that they could not recruit to a bigger number right now, given the historically low unemployment and other factors out there. So rather than chase a bigger Army that wasn't.
Well, I'm asking, why are we spending so much more and getting so much less?
I don't believe we are getting less. We have very capable
again,
systems that are
we've
better
cut-
than
we've-
the
we've-
Chinese systems.
We're spending more, and yet we've got half the ships and half the planes we had in 1985. This is unacceptable.
But again, the number, just counting people or counting ships.
What would you say are the biggest sources? Let me just ask you this. What would you say are the biggest sources of waste in the defense budget?
I think probably one of the biggest sources of high cost in the defense budget are the things that we buy that are so unique to the military that there's no commercial market for.
What are we, where are the biggest sources of waste in the Defense Department, or have you even turned your attention to that? Let me go. On Earth Day this year, President Biden said, I love this quote, "One of the things I found out as President of the United States, I get to spend a lot of that money. We're going to start the process where every vehicle in the United States military, every vehicle, is going to be climate friendly. Every vehicle, I mean it. We're spending billions of dollars to do it." A few years ago, the GAO reported that green energy mandates under Obama cost the Navy as much as $150 per gallon for jet fuel. That's high even for California standards. In 2012, the Navy was forced to purchase 450,000 gallons of biofuel for its so-called green fleet at the cost of $26.60 per gallon, when conventional petroleum costs just $2.50 per gallon. These mandates forced the Air Force to pay $59 per gallon for 11,000 gallons of biofuel in 2012, 10 times more than regular jet fuel costs. Is this a wise use of our defense dollars?
Well, I would say, as I said to Mr. Smith a few minutes ago, we have a big price increase for conventional fuel right now. So I think there's wisdom in us to
Paying more for non-conventional.
There's wisdom in us diversifying our sources
with all due
of
respect,
fuel,
Mr. McCord, that's
diversifying our sources
nuts.
of fuel and energy.
And that's sapping our ability to adequately field a defense force. One more thing. In 2010, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of Joint Chiefs, said that in his professional military judgment, our greatest national security threat was the national debt. That year, that debt was $13 trillion. Today, it's over $30 trillion. Does the administration agree that's still our biggest national security threat?
If you say the administration, I can't speak to what
the military
how the
establishment
president would rank these threats, but the debt is a threat, climate is a threat, China is. We have a number of issues we don't get to focus on.
So you would place the climate in the same category as China or the national debt? You know, countries that bankrupt themselves aren't around very long, because before you can provide for the common defense, you have to be able to pay for it. And don't tell me, oh, well, they've cut the deficit in half this year. That's compared to the blowout spending of the last 2 years. You go back to the last pre-pandemic year, the deficit this year under this budget balloons 50%. And it wasn't the Republican tax cuts. Revenues went up after those cuts, not down. The only reason the deficit continued was because we couldn't say no to spending. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to give the Undersecretary the opportunity to finish answering the question that Mr. McClintock asked, if you want to.
Chairman, let me just come back one more time on the subject of quantity versus quality, which I think is the part that you're referring to. We do have a reduction the Navy proposed, and we at OSD agreed with some older, less capable ships, the littoral combat ships, and in particular. Same on the aircraft side. The KC-135s that Mr. Kelly referred to are being replaced by the new KC-46s. Just counting the numbers, the things that we're divesting are not equal in any sense capable to the ones that we're buying, but they cost you money to maintain them, speaking of what is perceived to be wasteful. So ships that are not going to be effective in a high-end contest with China but cost us money to maintain, divert money from the things that we think we need to buy. And this is something that any executive would look at, right, is divesting from older, less capable things to move to newer technology. But these are difficult trade-offs for people, and it does lead to quantity reductions, having fewer ships or fewer aircraft. But again, we think these are wise investments, but these are things that we need to persuade Congress or not. I mean, that's a big part of every annual defense authorization debate is whether or not we will be allowed to retire older systems that we propose to retire.
Thank you for that answer. Now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Cirrus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under Secretary McCord, thank you very much for your service to this country. Mr. McCord, I am the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, and I am committed to ensuring our relationships with countries in Central, South, and in the Caribbean are always progressing. How does the Pentagon's requested budget impact U.S. national security in the Western Hemisphere?
Thank you. As you know, in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the in Central and South America, our so-called Southern Command area of responsibility, it continues to be an area where we have minimal military force, minimal military presence, and the whole of government center of gravity is more diplomatic, economic, which is why we have our Southern Command in Miami, which is sort of the financial and diplomatic capital of the region. We do continue to have a minimal economic force level there because the military threats don't justify more. The primary thing that we are continuing to look at here is the inroads that China is attempting to make using all of their levers, economic, loan, information. So that is probably the number one thing that we're looking at, in addition to, and then secondarily, the counter-narcotics issues are a big line of effort in that region. In the Western Hemisphere writ large, in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, we have the Northern Command, and we're looking at a wide range of issues from assisting Homeland Security with cyber protection of the United States and our critical infrastructure. So, in that meaning of Western Hemisphere, we have a lot going on.
What resources are being made available to ensure our regional partners and allies have support in countering malign influences in the Western Hemisphere? I know that we have different pacts with, let's say, with the Dominican Republic, or we have Costa Rica. Are we increasing our efforts and our money to work with these countries to improve the security of our country?
I would have to get you for the record whether what specific budget levels that there are. We have exercise budgets that are not always line item because we don't want to let them unfold, and we don't lock them in advance in our budget. But we are continuing the efforts that we've had in Southern Command area of responsibility with exercises with all of our partners.
You know, one rumor that's floating around in my community is that Cuba is working with Russia in terms of having another boat lift, happen. I'm just wondering if we are defensively prepared for such a exodus again from Cuba. Have you heard anything like that
I have not. I would have to consult with General Richardson, our commander at Southern Command, as to what operations and contingency plans are most prominent in Southcom's efforts and planning right now.
Thank you. And my last question has to do with the countries facing the Pacific. I'm talking about Argentina, I'm talking about Chile, I'm talking about Peru. How are we working with these people to offset the China influence?
Again, this gets back to, I know the chairman mentioned the whole of government approach, and as I did as well. This is something that we cannot do by ourselves as the Department of Defense. We are certainly keeping an eye on Chinese and Russian attempts to buy influence, to buy friends, to access resources in the region. But Southern Command by themselves does not have the authority, does not have the responsibility really of being the only way that we counter Russian and Chinese inroads in Central and South America. We do play our role, and that's why again Southern Command is co-located with so many other agencies in Miami, because we have connections to state and to Drug Enforcement Administration, all the other levers of government, the Coast Guard. Again, I would have to consult with General Richardson to get you a better answer on exactly what all of her plans are for her region.
Thank you, Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. McCord. Good to see you. I listened very carefully to Mr. Higgins' questions, and I thought he hit the nail on the head in regards to the impact of energy policies on what's happening in Ukraine. And I just wondered if you agree with that. Do you agree that energy policies were in many ways are linked to what's happening in Ukraine?
I would say it's undeniable that the politics and the policies of energies are very important. I think if you look at Putin's history, he tends to make a move in winter when he knows that his Western European neighbors are probably most sensitive to his ability to cut off their natural gas or to threaten to do so. And that the revenue that he gets from oil is hugely important to his economy.
Yeah, thank you. The fact of the matter is, and I think eventually we will be moving to cleaner sources of energy, but the fact of the matter is today, the world uses about close to 100 million barrels of oil per day, and disrupting that supply would have devastating consequences in many ways across the world. Do you believe that whether or not our nation is energy independent is important for our future security?
It is.
Under the previous administration, it was widely seen that that we were, as a country, energy independent. Do you agree with that?
I am not an expert in this field. I don't know that we've ever been energy independent in the industrial era.
But do you agree that some of the first actions that President Biden has taken reduced our energy production and our energy independence?
A little bit outside my area of expertise. I couldn't comment on that.
Well, I mean, clearly he did. In the first week of his presidency, he stopped, he reduced production. He has slowed up the permitting for a new production of oil and gas, and it makes no sense. Does that make any sense to you if a president is making those kind of decisions?
Well, I know that, for example, the Keystone Pipeline was a controversial decision under every administration over several years. So I think there was arguments on both sides.
But don't you think a president should be, at this point, particularly as we're seeing, and you already said you agree that energy is linked to what's happening in Ukraine, don't you think it would make sense for a president to do everything that he can to boost our production right now?
Well, there would be boosting production and boosting our climate resilience and boosting our electric vehicle and other. I mean, there's multiple ways you would want to attack this problem, I think.
You know, I think it's very difficult to look at the policies of this administration and not see how they are linked to what's happening in Ukraine. Even Zelensky and his advisors have said that our energy policies and policies of energy production in Europe have given the Putin the opening to do. He thought he had the leverage. We gave him leverage to do that. And then, as Mr. Higgins said, we helped to fund that war, fund what he's doing by continuing to buy oil from them. And then the other part of the energy policy is it has resulted in the inflation that we've seen today. And earlier this month, the House Armed Service, before the House Armed Services Committee, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said this budget assumes an inflation rate of 2.2%, which is obviously now incorrect when we've seen inflation of 8.5%, far outpacing what was predicted in this budget. Why do you think the budget has missed the mark in so many ways in regards to rising prices?
Well, I want to distinguish the inflation rate in the 23 budget is for FY23, which hasn't started yet and won't end for a year and a half from now. So no one can conclude that we know that it's right or wrong. I would concede that inflation today is higher than what it was when we were locking the budget.
Yeah, so you agree that they were wrong in the predictions of the budget in regards to inflation? Yes, I would agree that anyone who predicts inflation in advance is going to be wrong, and I know that we're going to get more data. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, said back in 2010 that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. At that point, our debt was 13.5 trillion, and now, as you know, it's over 30 trillion. One of the consequences of rising inflation that it's now forcing the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, which also raises the cost for the U.S. to pay the interest on our debt. How do you think additional spending on interest, which will absolutely be required as a result of policies that have led to inflation, how will that additional spending affect and perhaps undermine our national defense?
Well, that would be a question that is, obviously primarily in your wheelhouse here in the Budget Committee as to how you would assess whether mandatory spending on debt is going to change your decisions on discretionary spending or discretionary spending caps, should caps exist. But it's an issue for all of us, and especially for those of you on the Budget Committee, as to whether the mandatory side, mandatory spending such as interest on the debt, is going to change what we think we can afford on the discretionary side.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, I'd just like to start by expressing my agreement with my colleague here and my shared concern for the impact of the deficit on our ability to provide for our national defense. And that is one of many reasons why I voted against the Trump tax cut that provided millions for millionaires at the expense of our national security and ballooned the deficit to epic proportions. I think that your budget here strikes the balance right. I agree with your top line. I think that the administration is finding a way to balance the needs of the military with also the importance of diplomacy. As a Marine veteran myself, I saw every single day in Iraq the impact that diplomacy had on saving the lives of our troops. I align myself strongly with Secretary Mattis, who, as Mr. Trump's Secretary of Defense, emphasized how important it is to fund our diplomatic establishment, our more ammunition. Can you talk for a minute about how your budget supports our allies in Europe, meets the pacing threat with China, and balances all these things with the needs of the national security establishment today?
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Let me start with China. As you know, we don't have the alliance framework of multilateralism in Asia that we do in Europe, so we continue to do a lot of bilateral example. And the investments that we're making in this budget are designed to keep us in an overmatched position versus China on the high end. I think a number of members have commented that what's happening in Ukraine obviously has lessons, depending how this comes out, for calculations that President Xi may make. We are very cognizant of that as well. In Europe, we've talked a little bit this morning about energy. I think that's a great example of sanctions, whether sanctions should extend to Russian energy and how much they should extend. There are something that you have to go together with your allies on. It doesn't work very well, obviously, sanctions that are unilateral. So I think that is something that is a good example of the steps that Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin have taken to move together has been enormously helpful in Europe. I think many of us, you may have better foresight than I. Many of us were surprised and heartened how responsive the Germans, for example, have been on Nord Stream and on their defense spending increase, things that I think would not have happened had we not taken the time to try and bring everybody together. So I think that, as you say, these how we do this is very important, and we've tried to move together with and lead the pack.
Well, the fact that the administration has been able to coalesce our allies around this mission is actually quite extraordinary. And of course, Trump was working at cross purposes to that every single day that he undermined NATO. Thinking about the future, when I co-led the bipartisan Future Defense Task Force, we spent a lot of time thinking about how the department can get the best equipment and newest technologies into the hands of the warfighter at the speed of relevance. That means they need to get the stuff today. We can't wait till it becomes outdated. Do you think the DoD acquisition system is efficient enough to address these challenges and compete with China?
I think that all of us are looking for a way that we can be more agile but still be accountable and transparent enough. And your committee in the NDA created a Ppb Commission, so Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, which is the DoD-centric part of the larger federal budget process. That commission is now underway, co-chaired by a former comptroller and by a former AT&L or ANS executive.
That was my amendment, and I certainly hope it will be successful. I mean, one of our conclusions on the task force is that the system that we have today is not sufficient, that we have to reform it. But one of the other things we determined is that in the meantime, we can empower and reinforce the programs that are working. Deputy Secretary Hicks has openly discussed concerns with the shrinking defense industrial base, and the department has taken funding away from programs that are delivering critical capabilities, such as the Defense Innovation Unit. Now, DIU in particular has leveraged $25 billion in private R&D, introduced 100 new suppliers to DoD from 37 states in the face of a shrinking industrial base, and yet, shockingly, the department has cut its funding. So I agree with your top line, I agree with your strategy. I'm very proud of what the administration is doing in Ukraine, and yet I cannot understand why on earth you would cut the budget for DIU.
I'll have to get you a good answer for that one, Mr. Moulton.
Okay, well, I hope the answer is that we will restore
I would
funding.
just say also that we have, as you know, Bill LaPlante just on board for a little more than a week, so we now have a full house in terms of our leadership in the acquisition and sustainment world to go along with Undersecretary Hsu on the R&E side to help move us forward.
Well, I certainly hope it was just an oversight, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, the gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to China and your assertion that this budget provides us with an overmatched position vis-a-vis China. According to China's Ministry of Finance, they've increased their defense spending by 7.1% this year. It's highest level since 2019. While we truly don't know what China spends on its military, it could be even higher. I think folks in the national security community are concerned about China's military ambitions. As you said, you consider China to be a threat on par with climate. Is that an accurate assessment of your judgment?
Yeah, I would say, and I would echo what the Secretary Austin has said, we have threats that are very important that are not identical in nature. So COVID, for example, was a near-term threat to the health of our force and to the country. China is a longer-term threat, more of a military-centric threat. Climate is a more existential threat to our whole society. So they're important threats that are not identical threats.
So you're considering China a long-term threat. Let me quote the former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip Davidson, who stressed that China might try to forcibly annex Taiwan before 2027. That timeline reflects China's massive investments in naval power and its recent expansion of nuclear weapons. Are you aware of a report to Congress in 2020 titled Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China?
Is this a Department of Defense report you're referring to? I believe there's an annual report that has been instituted in the last couple of years that I don't know if that's the title of it. It sounds like it's
This is a regular report submitted for the last 20 years. The 2020 report states that China has already achieved parity with or even exceeded the United States in several military modernization areas, correct?
I don't have the report in front of me, but I don't dispute that it might have said that.
So you don't know which areas the report stated were of most concern?
I wasn't in the department in 2020, so I'm not familiar with the 2020 report.
Okay, the report states that China is ahead in the areas of shipbuilding, land-based conventional ballistic and cruise missiles, and integrated air defense systems. So do you think that a budget that would decommission 24 ships just this year while building 9 and projected that in the next 5 years our naval fleet would shrink further to only 280 ships, not meeting the legal requirement to field a fleet of 355 battleships, you think that would meet the needs of our position versus China?
That is exactly the intent, that the ships that the Navy proposes to decommission are ones that would not be capable in a high-end contest with China, whereas the ones that we're investing in would be.
All right, and at the same time, we're proposing to spend $3.1 billion on climate programs while cutting funding for ships, troops, and aircraft, $2 billion for climate resiliency at military installations, $247 million for operational energy and buying power, and $28 million for contingency preparedness. I would argue that this budget prioritizes Green New Deal initiatives over our military readiness vis-a-vis China, which, as I stated, is a near threat, not a long-term threat, as you earlier stated. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. First of all, just on the climate side, the 0.5% that's in our budget for this does not detract from our military capabilities. These are investments, and we're always going to be investing in our vehicles, especially our non-combat vehicles. So we want to be investing in ones that are in the same direction the market is moving. With respect to China, again, China is a long-term threat or a now and future threat. So when I say long-term, I don't mean to the exclusion of they're not of concern today, just that they are going to be with us. They're going to be an influential economic power and influential military power for decades to come. So it is not a short-term issue. It is a longer-term issue. But that doesn't mean it's not already in the window of being a concern of ours. And I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
I appreciate that, and as you said, Chairman Xi is watching how we conduct ourselves in Ukraine and is prepared to act if we are not showing strength. So I believe a stronger military budget focused on ships would be appropriate and send the right message to the Chinese. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Undersecretary McCord, for your service to our country. Deeply appreciated. To my colleagues, I wish we were spending more within this budget on addressing climate change as a national security threat. I'm glad there's at least a little piece in here that recognizes that, because certainly it's extremely important. Mr. McCord, you probably know I'm not a fan of the ballooning Department of Defense budget. You probably know that I think there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse, and if the Pentagon were to undergo a comprehensive audit, as every other agency has done, that would make an enormous difference, and it might get me more interested in putting more money into the defense budget. But at this point, the Department of Defense budget has ballooned to $740 billion in 2022, more than double the defense spending in 2000. Our defense spending makes up about half of all federal discretionary spending, even as we question our ability to pay for critical investments like childcare or housing or things that families across the country need. But I want to dive into one of the factors driving that spending, and that is the statutory requirement that DoD provide an unfunded priorities list, a wish list of items that would be nice for DoD to have, but are not required to carry out its duties. This is on top of the $773 billion requested by the White House for fiscal 2023. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said last year that the president's budget request for fiscal 2022 met DoD requirements, and yet the law still requires DoD to provide this unfunded priorities list. And that's why I've persistently offered an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to eliminate this wasteful practice. Mr. McCord, how does DoD determine what goes into the White House budget request versus the unfunded priorities list?
Thank you. The budget process is something that is led from the top down with input from the services up. Especially this year when we had a new strategy under development, we're looking at it all through the lens of what supports our strategy. So what goes in the budget are our highest priorities. I want to be clear about that. Nothing in an unfunded priority list is a higher priority than anything in our budget. So I know that they sometimes get misunderstood as somehow a service chief or a combat commander saying this is more important than what's in the budget. That is not the case. The law, as you said, I think they've been a practice for about 25 years, and they've been codified in law more recently than that. They are the opinions of senior military people. They are not vetted by civilians, including the secretary or myself or the service chiefs. So they are the best professional military advice. If of a particular senior officer, if in my area there were more funds, what would I choose to spend them on? But they should not be confused with saying that the budget is not adequate or that that things in the budget are less important than the things on those lists. But I think that they are easily misunderstood to be saying that they are must-haves that somehow trump the budget, which is not the case.
That is such an important explanation. These are just basically, wish I had this, nobody's really looked at it, we haven't looked at it in the context of the entire department. They're completely separate from the process that you go through as a department approved by the secretary to say these are the most important things that we need and must have. So in a June 2021 hearing before the Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, General Milley said of unfunded priorities, if they were critical, then they need to be higher on the priority list and in the base budget. Do you agree with that statement, Mr. McCord?
I do.
Thank you. And these unfunded priorities, again, are just a wish list that don't reflect the true needs of the United States. I understand that we're living in uncertain times with increasing global tensions because of the war in Ukraine. I think the president and his team have done a phenomenal job of really building a diplomatic coalition across the world. In response, Congress has authorized $1.35 billion in military assistance to Ukraine and $3.5 billion to the Defense Department to replenish its equipment stock. Is an unfunded priorities list even necessary to provide flexibility in military spending?
I would say the purpose of unfunded priority list is not generally about flexibility. It's about, in the opinion of a senior military person, that Congress, presumably by virtue of the legislation.
So the answer is no.
No.
No, the answer is no.
Flexibility is a process that we have to go through with the Congress, and Ukraine's a perfect example of how flexible the process can be when there's an emergent need that everybody agrees is important to address. The evacuation of Afghan interpreters was another one just in my time back in office. Our own process is sadly far less flexible, and we get our appropriation bills months late, every year.
Something I know the chairman has been making sure our side is not part of the problem here. But I thank you for that, Undersecretary, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back, and now I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again, Undersecretary McCord, for taking the time today to talk about Mr. Biden's defense budget proposal. Sadly, this budget is a continuation of the wokening and weakening of our military, and I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but I'm really not. Somehow we are spending more on defense than we ever have, but we're ignoring real national security threats like China, Iran, the complete invasion at our southern border with 2 million people coming into our country illegally, more than 2 million. So let's take a look at what Mr. Biden would like to spend this money on. Undersecretary McCord, would you say that this budget makes investments into making our military more green? Meaning, does this budget allocate funds to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
The investments that we have in our budget on climate resilience are not the primary metric is not greenhouse gas emissions. It's making us more climate resilient to the extreme weather events.
More green, electric vehicles and whatnot.
The electric vehicles part,
Okay.
yes. The installation part is not an emissions-based metric.
Thank you, Mr. Undersecretary. Mr. Biden has said that all federal agencies should be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Does this budget make investments towards getting there?
This budget makes investments in all of the president's priorities.
Okay, thank you.
There's a long time between now and 2050, so the direct line is hard to
there
connect.
was a mission put in place by your commander-in-chief, and this budget certainly gets the ball rolling on that goal to be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This puts that plan by your commander-in-chief into action, correct?
We would want to be moving in that direction, but again,
Okay, thank you,
this
Mr.
budget doesn't
Undersecretary. Well,
extend
frankly,
anywhere near to 2050.
Mr. Undersecretary, it sounds to me like you're burning the tax dollars at the altar of environmental extremists, because in this report that I have here that I would like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This report issued by your agency is not, quote, technically feasible for the DoD to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. end quote. This is your report, and it provides an example of the impacts woke Green New Deal policies would have in action, saying, quote, the DoD cannot, for instance, risk an armored brigade in combat running out of fuel because it's only allowed to acquire net zero fuel and none is readily available, end quote. So, Mr. Undersecretary, why are we proposing to spend billions, and some estimates from this report say trillions of tax dollars towards reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions when the DoD has already said that this is not feasible?
Well, again, net zero as a policy for a country or an agency is one thing. Our budget is not a budget to 2050. We could not possibly predict what kind of vehicles or aircraft we're going to be using in 2050.
But you're certainly
Probably
setting
nothing in
forward
the
those
report
goals
today.
to reach that in 2050 when we know that it's not feasible. And I'm sorry to cut you off. My time is short here. According to this report, I mean, it says trillions of dollars, but instead of wasting our time and tax dollars on turning our military green, let's talk about what really should be focused on. Earlier this year, I joined my colleagues in sending a letter to Secretary Austin asking for the congressionally required report on U.S. equipment left in, destroyed, or removed from Afghanistan during the disastrous withdrawal. We sent this letter 2 weeks after it was already due to Congress, and we still have not received the complete report or virtually any accountability for the surrender and the total failure that was Afghanistan. Mr. Undersecretary, is the DoD aware of this congressional request for the way overdue report on the Afghanistan debacle?
On the issue of equipment that was left behind, my understanding that I know I've seen draft reports. I believe that those reports have been submitted, but there may have been different requests.
Can you tell me how many tanks are currently in Afghanistan?
No.
With all due respect, Mr. Undersecretary, I've asked for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and I'm kind of getting bread here. We don't have the full and complete answers that we need. This is a congressional mandate that we get this report. Can you tell me how many rifles are in Afghanistan? If there's been reports that have been made, can you tell me how many rifles are left behind?
I would have to get for the record for you the reports that I've seen.
Do you know how much U.S. military ammunition is left in Afghanistan at the hands of the Taliban?
I'm sorry, munitions?
Yes.
Again, I would have to refer you to the reports. I don't prepare those reports myself.
Do you know how many night vision gear? How much of our night vision equipment is left there? So, Mr. Undersecretary, the point that I'm getting at here is we can't tell the American taxpayers how we have spent their money, how we have funded and equipped the Taliban, and now we're asking for more money. Mr. Undersecretary, do you think that Congress deserves this report?
Gentlewoman's time has expired, and but you're entitled to submit questions for the record.
Thank you very much. And may I also ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record? I apologize.
Yes.
I thought I had 39 seconds.
No, now you're over 30.
I see that.
Now, without objection, you may submit that for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank Undersecretary McCord and all of the leadership with the Department of Defense, and particularly our service members and their family members for their service every single day in protecting our national security. Too often in these hearings, we tend to get wound up in partisan talking points, and for some reason, we don't focus on the very people that we are here to pass a budget to serve, and that's the American people. And in this case, our service members who need the resources to be successful when they need it. So I'm sure I don't have to remind Undersecretary McCord, Department of Defense acquisition and modernization programs take years of planning and development. They require consistent and reliable funding in follow-on years to meet the needs of warfighters. Funding for our national defense is not some political prop that can be held up to score cheap political points. And yet, for all the bluster that we're hearing from some of my colleagues about the DoD's top line, it was their side of the aisle that held up the omnibus spending package for fiscal year 22 for nearly 6 months. They put putting critical, important, major acquisition programs at risk, prevented new programs from starting, and delayed pay raises for service members. Additionally, they degraded readiness at an extremely dangerous moment. And for the record, Joe Biden is the commander-in-chief. And when our allies needed us most, he's the one who helped to bring them together to make sure that we're holding Russia accountable. Inconsistent funding emboldens our adversaries and undermines the trust of our allies, a trust that we have had to fight hard to restore after the previous administration. So I want to be clear that the tactics are not just partisan ploys. They have real life effects for my district, for my constituents, and for service members around the world. Now, last year, I supported an increased top line for DoD spending. And this year, like every year, I will work hard in a nonpartisan way to ensure that the capabilities and systems included in the Pentagon's budget request are reviewed. Only after a careful assessment of the threat environment and our capabilities can we decide if an increase is again necessary to meet the complex challenges of our ever-evolving strategic environment. Under Secretary McCord, in my previous discussion with Department of Defense leaders, they have stressed to me that continuing resolutions do far more damage to readiness and the well-being of our service members than any of the hollow complaints we've heard here today. Could you please speak to the impacts that CRs have on military readiness and the importance of consistent funding for our most critical modernization programs?
Thank you for that question. Yes, this is something I think that is not well understood, and it's been hard to translate to the public because the organism that is the Department of Defense has adapted to perpetual CRs in a way that therefore you don't see contracts expiring because nobody tries to write a contract in the first quarter of a fiscal year anymore because they know that you're going to be under a CR and not going to be able to enter into new contracts. So there's the issue, first of all, of delayed resources, especially when there's inflation, but even when there's not, time is money, and when we lose time, we lose the ability to be agile, we lose resources. This year was particularly bad, as you say. It's sort of the threat to have a full year CR, which has never happened to the Department of Defense in history, was particularly troublesome to us, and we had a hearing. I had a hearing with the service chiefs before the House Appropriations Committee that spoke to this issue in some detail in January to lay out the problems. As you may know, we had a history beginning with sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall for about 20 years where the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill got enacted on average about 25 days into the fiscal year, which is reasonable. But beginning with the threat of default in 2011 that led to the Budget Control Act, and continuing since that day, that average has ballooned to 120 days into the fiscal year on average over the last dozen years, compared to 25 days for the 20 years before that. So we have definitely gotten into a bad pattern that needs to be broken. It does cost money. It does make us less agile when a number of members have pointed out that China does move fast, and we need to be able to, we can't afford to give away 3, 4, 5 months of a fiscal year every year to our adversaries by hamstringing ourselves.
Thank you. I know my time's expired. I just hope that all of us can come together and make sure that America succeeds by helping our service members and their families in this budget. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Mr. Secretary, your former boss, Defense Secretary Robert Gates, said a few years ago that President Biden, quote, has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades, end quote. Even former President Obama tried to warn people during the 2020 campaign, and he said, don't underestimate Joe's ability to screw things up. Americans seem to agree, as a Gallup poll in February showed, that only 40% of Americans approve of the way President Biden is handling foreign policy affairs. and only 36% approve of the way he's handling specifically the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think budget is further proof of this administration's misguided priorities. Would you say that Americans are safer today than they were in January of 2021?
I would.
On what basis?
I think we have strengthened our alliances, and I think the unified response that we've seen in Europe to Russian aggression has shown kind of a revitalized Western response of democracies.
If I may,
you wouldn't have seen the Germans.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Thank you for claiming my time. Can you explain why the Department of Defense wants to spend $3.1 billion on climate programs, or 4 times what the $682 million allocated for Ukraine? So $3.1 billion on climate programs in this budget, which is more than 4 times the $682 million allocated for Ukraine.
First, I would say that we are in this fiscal year spending more than that on Ukraine, and we are about to ask for another supplemental to increase to make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to continue the fight.
From a military standpoint, what's the $3.1 billion for on climate programs?
That is both on that has 2 basic parts. It's the installation side, our facilities, our buildings, our bases, and then
how does investing in climate programs help military preparedness, military readiness, military effectiveness?
Well, on the facility side and the resilience, it's to be better prepared for extreme weather events, which are increasing in frequency. On the vehicle side, the idea is to reduce our logistics footprints to have more capability to be not tethered to a logistic train of fuel in all cases.
This president,
and to move where the market is going.
Thank you. This president told our troops, of all people, our troops back in June, that the greatest threat to America is climate change. He even added his typical, "This is not a joke." I guess he needed to add the, "Hey, this is not a joke," because the soldiers were probably, I have to presume, surprised to hear from the commander-in-chief that the greatest threat to the country, and telling them as military personnel that the greatest threat is climate change. And then just last week, and you've kind of alluded to it already, the president stated that we're going to spend billions making every military vehicle climate friendly. I think that makes us the amusement of our adversaries around the world, that's what we're focused on. It's as embarrassing as it was to send John Kerry to essentially beg the Russians to consider the climate impact of the invasion if they were going to do that just before the invasion took place, even days before. But the president said, quote, "Every vehicle is going to be climate friendly. Every vehicle. I mean it. We're spending billions of dollars to do it." Do you think that climate concern should be the main priority for our military vehicles?
It is not the primary concern. Their effectiveness is. But
well, the president said that we're going to spend billions to do that. This budget, switching gears to another topic, contains $34 million to address, quote, "concerning behaviors and extremism." What does this mean? What's the purpose of that funding?
As Secretary Austin has stated, the incidence of extremism in the military is low, but any amount is not acceptable, and so these efforts.
Well, I want to interject there on Secretary Austin. I'm glad you brought him up because he said when we were asked to give an exception to approve him in the House because he didn't meet the 7 years of required retirement between military and civilian service, he said that his self-proclaimed mission essentially was to root out racism in the military. Is that truly a significant problem? I mean, for him to say that's one of the reasons why he was there, to root out racism in the military, it seems to me the military has been an example of integration of merit-based performance and advancement, as evidenced by Secretary Austin and Secretary Powell before him on the Secretary of State side. Is this truly a significant problem for our heroes in the military?
Well, I would say, first of all, racism exists in society. It exists in every institution.
They were to spend $34 million to address it in the military.
But racism and extremism are 2 different topics, and I think you were citing a figure about addressing extremism. Racism is a different issue, and I would certainly say Secretary Austin probably has more experience with this issue than I do, and so I certainly would not question his.
All right, well, my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize another gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, in the Reagan administration, we were talking about a 600-ship Navy. Without getting into classified information, can you tell us what size Navy we could expect if this budget is approved, and how that compares to the size of other nations' navies?
Mr. Scott, I would say that our Navy, and a 30-year shipbuilding report was just sent to Congress, so you can look at different periods of years out to, several decades out in the future, but we're in the 300 ship range right now. We were not in the 600 ship range before. There was talk of a 600 ship Navy, not the reality of a 600 ship Navy before, but we are looking to have a very capable force, the most capable Navy in the world by far, at about 300 ships.
And how does that compare to the size of navies of other countries?
I don't have the figures of all the navies around the world at my fingertips. We can get you.
Well,
that
well,
information from the record. It is the most
others.
capable Navy in the world.
If we're going to build ships, you have to maintain them. What are we doing to upgrade the ship repair facilities at public yards? How's that coming?
Well, we have some major investments in our shipyard capability, primarily on the submarine side. You're probably familiar with the so-called SIOP, S-I-O-P, a Navy acronym for a shipyard investment plan. That's basically a 20-year plan, $20 billion 20-year plan for the 4 public shipyards that have not been seen the kind of maintenance they need for a century. And so these are addressing our ability primarily to take care of our nuclear force. In addition, we have investments in the submarine workforce, those are probably the primary ship investments we have, is to keep our submarine industrial base and our submarine yard and our shipyards capable of moving through this period where we're buying both Columbia and the Virginia class at the same time, which puts some additional stress on that part of our industrial base.
And what kind of priority is made to make sure that the private repair yards get enough work to stay in business?
Well, on the private repair yards,
minority-owned shipyards.
Yes, sir. The private yards, as you know, focus much more on the surface side, and there I think one of the best things we can do is have stable, predictable funding, getting to the point of the previous question about perpetual continuing resolutions. Stable, predictable funding will be a great benefit to the private sector yards because they have always, as you know, have always had to be more flexible than the public yards because they flex up and down when funding is unpredictable. So that I think is probably the best thing we can do. In addition, we need to get our private sector yards producing the ships on time. So we have been putting more money into, say, buying destroyers at 2 a year, but they're not able to produce 2 a year. That leads to all kinds of problems in terms of maintenance cycles if you can't get the ships out of the yard. And we all know that the ship industrial base, shipyard workers are one of the areas that has been a supply-demand issue right now in terms of getting the skilled workers you need. Is a big challenge for the Navy.
Is the Army Corps of Engineers budget in your portfolio?
It is not. The Army Corps of Engineers is part of the department, but their budget is on the civil side and does not come through me.
If you fail to we've had disparaging remarks made about climate change. If you fail to invest in resilience to protect against sea level rise, what will happen to military assets like the Naval Station at Norfolk?
Well, that is one of the things that concerns us, is the Navy and the Marine Corps particularly are vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather and sea change. We alone as the Department of Defense, to be clear, cannot prevent climate change, and we are not attempting to prevent it by ourselves. We are trying to be responsive to it and look ahead and get out ahead of changes so that our installations are more capable of dealing with these events and doing what we can to be part of the solution, but we are not going to solve the problem by ourselves.
And I introduced legislation that was signed into law as part of the recent NDAA to allow mitigation of stormwater flooding around military bases. How is that going to be implemented?
Mr. Scott, I would have to get you that for the record from our installations community. I can't speak to that from my own expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary McCord, I'd like to continue a line of questioning regarding inflation. Obviously, that's been front of mind for many members of Congress, and I mentioned in the Department of Defense as well. In your testimony, you mentioned that in preparing the budget, you used a chain-weighted inflation index as a benchmark rather than consumer price index. Can you talk a little bit more about the assumptions that were made in preparing the budget and what rate of inflation for the chain-weighted price index that you're assuming?
Yes, sir. The reason that we use the rate that we use is that it is, first of all, in U.S. code, that's what we're supposed to be using, but also because of the biggest single category of what we do is purchases of goods and services from the private sector, and that's a pretty good metric for a GDP deflator to measure.
Sure. So what number did you use in preparing the budget?
For the budget, for what we did was the FY20, if I can walk one step back, the FY22 budget was prepared assuming about 2.2% inflation for the year that we're in now. What we did was we looked at the data, it had doubled to 4 by the time we were wrapping up our assumptions in December. So we built that price increase into our budget for 23. So based on what was happening in the calendar year that just ended, calendar year 21. For the budget for FY23, we use, like as with every administration, OMB produces one set of economic assumptions that every agency uses. That inflation rate is 2.2%. And so the question that has been discussed this morning and in other venues is whether that's the right assumption for the fiscal year that's going to start this September, based on the fact that it's higher than that right now. But we don't get to decide what to use for 23. We use consistent assumptions across an administration, as every administration does. For 22, we did our best working with OMB and working with the president to up our price basing across this 5 years so that we were not falling behind on what was happening last year. But the situation has continued to change, as most primarily, again, the spike in energy prices since the Russian invasion of Ukraine was something that is not in our budget, could not have been in our budget. We were already done with our budget by then. So this remains something we need to work with the
Sure.
Congress on.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you said that you were prepared to work with Congress to address those impacts. On a historical basis, if you look at our investment in the Department of Defense in real dollars, how do we compare historically right now to where we've been in the past?
We're at a relatively high level, especially when you consider the number of people in our force is smaller. So we have a smaller, highly compensated force, which has been true for a number of years and is true today. So
Okay.
we're on somewhat the higher end, and of course you could always have debates with people about, do you take the cost of something like Iraq or Afghanistan, do you include those or do you exclude those as unique events? But our budget is on the high side in real terms right now.
Okay, so I've seen other measures that disagree with that assessment. And I don't think it's fair to measure it in terms of the number of people in our armed forces, because as you have described, the number of people is declining, but our need for a robust Department of Defense is certainly still very high. And I'm concerned that we can't fall behind the curve there on a real dollar basis. But with the time I have left, I wanted to ask about something on a different topic. So I understand that there's been a debate in the Department of Defense about a change in philosophy from a counterinsurgency point of view towards more of a response to near peers like Russia and China, as geopolitical events have shifted in the last few years. I represent some of the largest training bases in the country. I'm honored to represent Fort Irwin, the Marine Air-to-Ground Training Center in 29 Palms. Does this budget make the necessary investments to shift our training philosophy in response to this shift in DoD philosophy from counterinsurgency to near peer?
I would say that's the intent, but certainly our Army and Marine Corps leadership could probably give you better, and you probably already have better specific information about the combat training centers and how they're adapting. But yes, we are trying to move our focus of both our modernization and our training to the near peer or high-end competitions, exactly as you said.
All right. Well, thank you. I see my time's expired. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes. He's not, is he virtual? Is he not? Okay, I'm sorry. I skipped my friend, Mr. Grothman. Now you have 5 minutes. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Thank you very much. Looking through some articles about your department, I notice here's an article that was written last week, and the plan is to decommission 2 littoral combat ships. They were kind of big ships. I think those ships are about 100 yards long. Big stuff. I've seen them. One was built in, I believe, 2015, and one was built in 2016. So these are rather large ships. I'm sure very expensive to build an over 100-yard ship. And we plan on declassifying them less than 10 years in. I'm glad you're doing it if it's a waste of money. Do you have any comments on how that could happen? How we could build a big ship and 10 years later we want to scrap it?
Thank you. Yeah, the issue with those particular ships is that first of all, that as the strategies have focused more, as was just discussed, toward the high-end peer competitors, both the Mattis strategy and Secretary Austin's strategy, these ships are not as consistent with these new strategies that focus on a high-end fight against a very capable military like China. Secondarily, on the littoral combat ships, several of them, the mission packages for these ships never delivered in a correct and usable form. So the ships basically do not have the capability they were supposed to have, even on top of the question of whether that's the right capability for the future.
Okay, would you say it's accurate if I say we wasted money building the USS Jackson and the USS Montgomery?
The littoral combat ships that we are decommissioning, I would say were not our best use of funds.
Okay, so I think a goal we should have is to make sure we don't make any more mistakes like these 2 big 100-yard ships that we're decommissioning almost right after they were built. Do you think they were built, well, I don't know at the time, were they things that were built because of pressure from Congress when the Navy didn't want them that much in their own right?
I think at the time there was a desire to have ships that would be more agile for a wider range of missions that maybe wouldn't be so much on the high end. But again, as the strategies have shifted to we do want to focus on the high end, they have a bit of a strategic mismatch, and then there's a particular problem of these ships' mission packages did not deliver.
Yep. I'm afraid we don't have enough missile defense, enough cyber defense. I think there are things that we aren't looking at because to a degree, we may be fighting the last war, or maybe going back about 6 wars, 5 wars. I remember reading about, the Battle of the Midway in World War II, and at the time, some people felt it showed that aircraft carriers were overrated, and that was proven in 1941. Was it 42? 42. Battle of the Midway was 42. Okay, now I've had people tell me that aircraft carriers, well, there is nothing more beautiful and impressive looking than an aircraft carrier. Against a country like China or North Korea, in war games, they may last a day or 2 days. Are there smart people who believe that against a country like Russia or China or North Korea, an aircraft carrier may only last 1 or 2 days?
I would say that there absolutely are analysts who believe that carriers have questionable survivability in a high-end fight, and the Navy would strongly dispute that. So that is something you could have an entire good classified debate on. There are definitely people who believe as you state.
Yeah, I run into them, and it kind of bothers me because I think we're short of missile defense and short of cyber defense, and we keep these big aircraft carrier groups out here. And like I said, it was a very different time, but we were able to sink some Japanese aircraft carriers very quickly in 1942, and they do, compared to missiles, are very slow. And
I would also say that the Navy would say that compared to a base on land that can't move at all, carriers are much more agile than any other way to project power. So again, there are some different...
I've heard that argument that by that standard, nothing is worthwhile, right? Not only would they sink an aircraft carrier right away, they destroyed an Air Force base right away. but do you feel in your heart that if we went to 10 aircraft carriers or 9 aircraft carriers and used that money for missile defense or cyber defense, we would be more in tune with the times if our real goal is to protect the United States of America?
What we tried to do in this budget, and gets exactly at the point that you're doing, is try and address our challenges on a number of fronts and not say we can only do a maritime threat or only do missile defense or only do cyber. We tried to put chips on a number of places we wanted to put bets. I think it's a continuing question what the future of surface warfare is. Certainly the movement in the maritime world is more toward moving eventually toward unmanned, moving toward more distributed sets of naval architecture. But we are, it's not at the expense of missile defense. Missile defense tends to be, if anything, technologically limited of what is technologically capable to be done as quickly as you'd like it to be done rather than funding constrained.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the chairman for indulging me. I'll point out if one of those aircraft carriers gets sunk, in addition to the huge waste of money, there are 5,000 people on each of them who die. So whether you want to take that into account, I don't know, but thank you for giving me.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Thanks the Undersecretary for being here today. Mr. Undersecretary, you're familiar with the position of the comptroller at the Pentagon. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. This is my second time. I've been back since the 1st of June, and I served in the position previously.
So for several years, I've tried to get the Pentagon to audit, as every agency was required to do, 20 years ago, and to get the audit undertaken at the Pentagon. I think fiscal year 2018, the first audit was finally undertaken. No great surprise, it wasn't passed. And what we have been told is that by 2027, the clean audit will in fact be done. Is that still, that's 4 years from now, is that still the glide path that you're envisioning for the clean audit for the Pentagon?
I think that is still the best estimate that we have, yes.
Are you able to implement any improvements of problems that you find along the way? Like in a business, there'd be continuous quality improvement in any lean manufacturing process. Are you able to incorporate any of those things as you're encountering them?
Yes, the main things that we're trying to focus on are the systems controls, and probably the hardest thing that we have to do is trying to get rid of older systems that we still rely on every day to do our many business processes. But yes, we are implementing control. We are implementing as we go. We are finding that some of the notices we get from our auditors are now more complex than the first round or two. So they're not easy. They're more difficult to get through. But we are making progress, but it is not fast enough.
Sure. Well, I want you to continue to keep a focus on that. Let me just ask you also, in the process of working on the NDAA several years ago, in 2020, severe problems with base housing were uncovered. The privatization of base housing that occurred back in the 1990s, trying to offload that appropriation from the Department of Defense and farming it out. 20 years later, 30 years later, some of those properties now are suffering, and maintenance has been deferred. So NBC News is reporting on the Senate report from the Senate Homeland Security Committee that of the problems that still exist in base housing. So can you do anything to assure us that that is still a high priority for the Pentagon to bring that base housing up to standard?
Yes, sir. I'm familiar with. I read a report of the hearing that you described on the Senate side this week, and I would say that while not directly under my purview, we do have a nominee pending that would really own that responsibility. The Tenant Bill of Rights, which I'm sure you're familiar with in the NDAA, I would say if it is not proving, if there's enough time to determine that it still needs further improvement, then that is something the department should work with the Congress on. I know that it had, I believe, over 30 different aspects to it, some of which may not have been completely rolled in yet. But as you described, I remember when housing privatization started, it was always a bit of, it was a, by Pentagon standards, it was a bold move into privatization, and the rubber was always going to meet the road, not up front when the houses were being built, but later on in the middle of the deals, which is where we are now. And I think it is important that we work with the Congress to make sure that we stay on top of this within the realm of things that are privatized, and having DoD have its appropriate share of responsibility, and the contractor having theirs.
I'm just going to have to reclaim my time because I'm going to run out. Let me just ask you: we're going to be asked to provide a good deal more in the way of military assistance to Ukraine. They've got a terrible problem, and it's horrifying what is going on over there. But can you share with us, does the administration kind of have an overarching strategy about where they are going with this? We keep hearing about Stinger missiles going over. We keep hearing about Javelin missiles going over. Are these coming from our existing stock? Are we replacing those? How is that all working together right now?
Yeah, thank you for that question. What we have done is worked in concert with our allies. There's about 30 countries that are helping Ukraine, so it's not all on us to help them, although we are, as is often the case, leading the coalition and leading the effort. Yes, we are donating from our own stocks. We are also looking to find from any place that we can. Secretary Austin and General Milley spend basically part of every day on the phone with people from other countries trying to get them to contribute as well, especially Russian-type equipment that Ukrainians are more familiar with. So there is both the U.S. side of equipment, U.S. NATO standard equipment that's being delivered to them, and especially from Eastern European countries that have more familiarity with it, Russian-style ammunition and equipment. So we're doing both. We have done 8 drawdown packages, 8 packages where we have drawn down our own supplies and given to Ukraine. Congress gave us funding to replenish those, and we have sent out 2 notices so far. So we've sent about $3.2 billion out the door. We have started the clock on $2 billion of that to start replenishing our own, and get our industrial base spent up to start replenishing those missiles for ourselves. But we are now to the point of expending all of the authority Congress gave us in the Ukraine supplemental attached to the omnibus appropriations bill from 6 weeks ago, and we anticipate sending another supplemental to Congress probably this week to continue to show that we are in this with the Ukrainians to get them what they need to fight, to continue the fight to defend themselves. So I think the overall message is we are not letting up on the gas. The Ukrainians are fighting hard for their own country. We want to continue to do what we can to support them.
Yeah, we'd love to see the strategy, though, that the administration is pursuing. Right now, it just seems as a need comes up, we fill it. As a need comes up, we fill it. But where are we going? Where is this going to end up? Because remember, it was these folks that
Gentleman's time has long expired.
underestimated the resiliency and the resolve of the Ukrainian people. Everyone said it would be over in 3 days. Well, it wasn't. And I can't believe that the geniuses in charge couldn't anticipate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Undersecretary, for being here. As Congress is currently debating how to provide additional military resources to the Ukraine, and it seems quite possible the U.S. military and financial support for Ukraine will continue to be a topic of discussion over an extended period of time. Is it your assessment and that of the DoD that the Ukraine needs additional assistance and needs it as soon as possible?
It is. The fight's ongoing, and so whatever we can get them in the very near future, it could be hugely important to them.
I agree wholeheartedly. Additionally, there are concerns that proposing a defense budget that is effectively a cut to our defense budget sends a signal to our adversaries, especially Russia during the current invasion of the Ukraine, that we plan to be less robust on national security. This also sends a signal to our allies that we may not be able to support them in times of need. What are the DoD plans to replenish our European partners' defense systems since they've sent a bulk of theirs to the Ukraine. How is the United States prepared to bolster, there's another element of the question, the same question, bolster Sweden and Finland's defenses if those countries decide to enter NATO or be accepted in NATO? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me address the second part first. I think we, the Defense Department, and I believe the administration would be very supportive of Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO, and I personally would expect that this may well be on the agenda for the late June summit, that it could be ready by then. I think that would be a welcome development, and one of the reasons it would be welcome is that they are very capable already and shouldn't need a lot of help from us to be contributing to the team immediately. Should they desire to join the team, I believe they'd be welcomed as very capable partners without requiring a lot of assistance from us. It probably would lead to discussions about interoperability and maybe shared industrial-based use, but not needing a lot of direct help from us. Your first question about other countries that have also contributed equipment to Ukraine, I think that's going to have to be a case-by-case basis. So, I mean, just to take, I don't mean this to be an extreme-sounding example, but if one person or one country is sort of cleaning out their attic of things that they never used and aren't going to miss and aren't going to really ask them to, they're not digging very deep, and another country is maybe is more threatened by Russia and is digging deeply into things that they really need replenished. I think you can imagine those are pretty different cases as to whether or not it should be on us and the American taxpayer to refill everybody's coffers, or I think more of a case-by-case basis would be more appropriate.
So I hope it's not the case, or is it that some are just emptying out their attics and their weaponry that is not worthwhile to the Ukraine? Is that the case?
I only posit that as an example, that some people are giving things that are less important to them than others, and are maybe less on the front lines than others.
Great. Okay.
Every contribution is important to the Ukrainians.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
I'm sorry, gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, thanks for being here and taking the time. I kind of want to delve a little bit into defense contracting a little bit. Obviously, we know how important defense contracting is to DOD, our entire military apparatus, especially when it comes to building and maintaining ships and equipment for our men and women. But we also do have to acknowledge it appears that there have been real issues associated with prolonged timelines for maintenance and or new equipment to actually be put into service. When you guys are going through your cost projections and the budget, does DOD take into account the additional costs associated with potentially prolonged projects? Because in any contract that ever exists, the longer it takes to execute, typically the more expensive it becomes. So does DOD take into account for that in its budget?
That's a great question. I would say probably not enough in that when we know that a contract is going to take X amount of time to execute and for the service or the good to be performed and delivered, that amount of time is built into the cost estimate. So if you know something's going to take 2 years, you're going to have a different inflation assumption, a different cost assumption than something that's going to deliver much more quickly. What I think we probably don't do well, even though I said that we're used to continuing resolutions and a pattern of delayed budgeting in terms of knowing that we're not going to be able to enter into contracts in the first quarter of a fiscal year, I don't know that we have changed our cost estimating to account for this pattern of delays as well as we could have.
Real quick follow-up to that. I mean, is there something that you believe, obviously outside of, consistent budgeting on Capitol Hill, which, by the way, I would agree with you on. That's something that Capitol Hill should be doing, is consistent budgeting. But is there anything outside of that the administration is starting to look at with respect to making sure that our contracts actually, they're actually executed on time, and that we actually are doing everything we can with respect to a lot of equipment, a lot of ships that are just sitting in dry dock waiting for maintenance to be completed?
Yeah, those are probably the hardest examples because you have, when you get into something as complicated as a ship and you maybe find different corrosion than you expected, and or you have issues with your workforce, as been a real big issue on the ship side, is getting the skilled workers in those particular trades when you need them, given the the tight labor market. I don't know that we have a systematic report for you. But when the issues that we're aware of, and particularly on the ship side, we do have attempts to address either the infrastructure or the workforce or both. But if you're asking about contracting writ large, I would have to probably get you an answer for the record from our acquisition and contracting community.
Yeah, I would appreciate
to a
that.
broader
The
set
only
of-
reason why and I don't mean to shut you down, I know what you're saying is important, but I'm also running out of time. I want to get somewhere else. But I would appreciate a more detailed answer with respect to that. One thing I do want to highlight in our discussion right now is really how important inflation and labor is to the functioning, not just of DOD, but our economy overall. I was having a conversation with members of one of my city councils, and they were trying to address so many issues affecting their city, but so many of those are impacted by fiscal policy and monetary policy out of Washington, specifically with inflation and how that does impact labor markets. So obviously you guys are feeling that at DOD as well. I think it's important that the administration takes a lot of their future fiscal and monetary decisions into account of how broad and widespread those impacts are when you're trying to do simple things like, finish a ship on time, get equipment out where it needs to be, build an affordable housing project, or even private contractors building single-family homes. It is universal, the destructive impacts of inflation and bad fiscal policy. I do want to switch gears real quick, and we're running out of time. The president made a statement the other day that he wants the military to essentially be all electric and to go green. Let's just be perfectly honest. Is it even possible for the military to do that, one? And then number two, can the United States military completely survive on wind, solar, and a quote-unquote green renewable energy matrix?
I appreciate your on inflation. I will say that, yeah, that is something that we are very sensitive to as well. Of course, we are subject to all the same pressures and all the same factors in terms of labor prices and getting skilled workers that you describe. On vehicles and airplanes, again, airplanes are what consume the vast majority of the energy that DoD consumes. I don't think that there's any immediate prospect of us having a fundamentally different type of airplanes that we're using. Whether they're manned or unmanned, they're going to still rely on the same type of fuels for the foreseeable future. So I don't think that we really should be focusing on whether, the non-tactical side is much easier to work with in terms of getting that to be more electrified. The combat vehicles, the combat side is going to be a much longer term prospect if it's possible.
Mr. Chairman, if you give me leeway, a real brief follow-up to that, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCord, is it possible to fly an F-16 or an F-35 on biofuels?
I'm not aware that we've had biofuels experiments on aircraft the way that we have on ships, so I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was chairing a committee in Judiciary, and thank you for your courtesies. Secretary McCord, thank you for the time that you've given us. Let me quickly go to personnel matters, and I have a boatload of questions, and so your typical defense pithiness would be greatly appreciated. Again, thank you for your service in the service of so many men and women in the United States military. Just coming back from Ukraine, I was with the 82nd Airborne, all ready and serving, and then previously was with the United States Army as well on the Belarus-Lithuania border. So thank you so very much, and I know our men and women are around the world. Let me focus on the question of the quality of life. What wars have been somewhat behind us. What kind of investment are you making in PTSD, the issues dealing with women's health? I've been an advocate for fighting against triple-negative breast cancer. I'd like to see that program expanded. And then personnel dollars, in terms of increased salary and housing. If I could just take that package, because I want to go on to something else, but I'm interested in the quality of life issues that you deal with the men and women in the United States military.
Yes, in the interest of time, we will get you an answer for the record on the PTSD and some of the particular issues in the health budget that you mentioned, rather than me trying to guess at them without all the facts at my fingertips. I'm sorry, Congressman, I can't hear you right now.
Ms. Jackson Lee, are you?
Yes. Can you generally, Secretary McCord, give a general commitment to these quality of life issues and making sure funding in your budget is there?
Absolutely. Secretary Austin has a huge focus on taking care of our people. He talks about it with us all the time, as it's a very high priority of his.
Great. Let me ask you about the outcomes of a study assessment program dealing with an officer's fitness for command. Any future steps with the DoD and the Army might be taken to implement a qualitative interview process in the BCAP?
I will say that that's outside my area of expertise, but I have heard the Army describe what they're trying to do to make sure that they make the best possible selections in terms of fitness for command. But I would have to get you an answer from the Army on the status of that program in more detail. I am familiar with it, and I have heard Army leadership discuss it.
All right, I will focus on the DoD has requested $479 million to implement the 80+ recommendations from the review dealing with the sexual assault. In requesting those dollars, what will be the oversight to make sure that these dollars are implemented properly across the gamut of the jurisdiction of the Pentagon and the various military branches?
Thank you. The primary oversight that I believe you will see in that area is the Deputy Secretary Hicks has something called a Defense Workforce Council, which is meant to sort of provide the same kind of oversight that we often see on weapons programs and investments, to have the same oversight of our personnel-related programs. That is the venue that would be vetting our efforts on sexual assault prevention. In addition to the action officers, of course, at lower levels that are actually running the programs, but the Deputy Secretary would probably be the primary oversight of that.
What, well, let me, overall defense budget comes in many different forms. Want to make sure that there is going to be strong focus on the infrastructure that the United States military bases, housing, and that the Secretary and the Defense Department will have a focus on that. Let me just give you two questions so that you can answer. That's the number one. And secondarily, as I indicated, many of us have been to the border dealing with the despotic violence that President Putin is exhibiting against innocent human beings. The question is, we have given unanimous consent. The President has offered some additional huge dollars coming from the Defense Department for Ukraine in terms of weaponry. And do you have a projected schedule of continuing that, or those particular ones that have just been issued in the last, say, 48 hours, 72 hours, when their time would be reaching into the region?
Yes, thank you for that question. In the last week or two, the drawdown, as they're so-called, the Presidential Drawdown Authority packages, once approved by the Secretary and the President and announced, have been on airplanes on their way to Europe within about 48 hours. So from the time these decisions are made, the equipment is moving very rapidly. There is no higher priority, I think, of General Milley and Secretary Austin than keeping an eye on exactly what is flowing. And not only is it on an airplane, is it on a ship, has it arrived in Europe, but is it across the border into the hands of Ukrainians? So that is being tracked on a daily basis at very senior levels. We have used, as of this week, we will probably have used all the authority that Congress gave us for additional drawdown, and we anticipate coming back to Congress in the coming days to get more authority to continue to help the Ukrainians.
I hope in the course of that, you all will have a classified briefing for members of Congress, so that would add to their understanding. Our constituents have been very supportive, but I know our overall perspective is that we want peace, so we know where we are in this raging, vicious war against Ukraine. And so we've got to provide defense as we discuss ways of solution. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary McCord, you didn't, I know it's ended, but very quickly, the infrastructure.
Yeah,
you know,
gentlewoman's time's
repairing-
expired. You can submit a question for the record. But
Well, thank you. If you
you
can
already-
answer the one about the repair, thank you. I yield back.
All right. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Undersecretary, thank you for being here. And as you're aware, Mr. Secretary, there are 4 combat readiness training centers in the United States. I have the honor and privilege of representing one of those in Savannah, Georgia. And it is proposed under this budget to be closed. Now, aside from the lunacy, and I will refer to it as lunacy, of considering closing any combat training center, combat readiness training center, at this point in world history where we could potentially be on the brink of World War III is just insane to me, especially when you take into consideration that the Savannah facility is the most utilized and the most efficient of any of the 4 combat readiness training centers here in America. Not only that, but you know, the most frustrating thing it's all frustrating, but another frustrating part of this is the fact that 2 years ago, in 2019, I should say, in 2019, there was $24 million allocated to build a new hangar for that facility. Now that hangar is under construction right now. The ribbon cutting on it is slated to happen in September. I've been invited and I look forward to being there. $24 million, it should be completed by then and we'll have the ribbon cutting on it. And then it is slated to be closed in April of 2023. Not only that, but the facility also, about 3 weeks ago, had $1.2 million worth of computer equipment installed there. Computer equipment that's not available anywhere else in the country at any of the other combat readiness training facilities. That $1.2 million worth of computer equipment that was installed, again, in April of 2023 is going to be gone to waste. No wonder taxpayers get so upset about wasteful spending in the federal government. Now, how important is that training center? Every F-22 pilot over the last 2 years has been trained at that facility. I just have to ask you, Mr. Secretary, what is more important to our readiness and ability to counter threats across the world like Russia and China? Climate and social spending or an actual military asset like the Savannah Combat Readiness Training Center?
Mr. Carter, it's clear that you know much more about this particular training center than I do, so I'm not going to offer you an explanation that is not as well informed as your question is. I'm going to have to get with my colleagues for the record of what was the rationale on capacity or other grounds for this particular proposal.
But you can understand, particularly in the environment, the world environment that we're in. We all know what's going on. We see it every day on TV, on social media. We've got a front row seat to a war that's going on here that could potentially lead us into World War III. I just finished reading a book about World War II, The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson. And you know that when Germany invaded Great Britain, they never intended to bomb London. It was actually a mistake made by one of the generals, one of the Nazi generals. Can you imagine what a mistake an errant missile would do if it were to hit a NATO country right now? We'd be in World War III. And yet we're talking about a budget that recommends closing a combat readiness training center, the most efficient, the most utilized that we have here, where we just about to complete a $24 million hangar, where we just installed $1.2 million in computer equipment. And yet this budget includes billions of dollars to go toward climate change. Why isn't that money being used to keep these facilities open?
Mr. Carter, I agree that we owe you an explanation of the proposal on the CRTC that you're describing. I'm not familiar with the details enough myself.
Obviously, this is very upsetting. It's upsetting for me, it's upsetting for my constituents, it's upsetting for Americans to even think that we would even consider this. I look forward to your response, Mr. Secretary, and I hope that you will be able to provide me with that and provide some kind of explanation and consider doing away with some of these climate change initiatives and keeping this much-needed facility open. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I now yield myself 10 minutes. You only have to deal with me now, Undersecretary. I have kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm going to ask it. Are you aware of any time when the Department of Defense has requested a budget that was less money than they thought they needed?
I'm not.
And I think it's interesting to have this discussion because we're hearing from a lot of people that seem to be questioning whether we are providing enough money for defense, and that's always certainly a valid question. We always have to ask that. Armed Services has to ask that as well. But the experts are at the Pentagon, the people who actually have the responsibility for defending the country, and I assume that they're not going to be derelict in their duty since they've given their life for the defense of their careers, for the defense of this country, and they're not going to ask for less money than they think will be adequate to defend the country. And the question I have is, we can argue about percentages, we can argue about inflation, we can argue about declassifying some equipment, reducing the number of service members, but can you tell us today that with this budget, we have not in any way diminished our capacity to defend the United States?
Chairman, I would say that far from it, we feel like we have made progress, we are making progress, would make progress in this budget across the board on any number of fronts, to keeping the triad strong and modern and capable, to space resilience, to the quality of our people. What I would say that our budget does not do, no budget can do, is reduce all risk, eliminate all risk. That's not the realistic standard by which this department leadership or any department leadership can present a budget to you that we've now eliminated all security risks to the United States. So there will always be someone who could say, I could use more here for X. I think, it would be helpful, but in terms of balancing and addressing our risk across not only the national security space, but in the whole government framework as well as the defense-specific framework, we feel like we have a very strong budget that does everything that Secretary Austin told the President we needed to accomplish, and the President gave the Secretary what he asked for.
Thank you for that answer. Now, I know you don't want to ask the $3.1 billion climate change question again, since it's been asked by virtually every member of the Republican side, but can you give us some examples of how climate change has already impacted the military?
Yes, sir. The primary things that we look at are our own installations, especially those on the coast, have suffered significant financial impact of storm damage in recent years, and hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars have gone to repair extreme weather damage at places like Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. More importantly, perhaps, as we look out into the future, is climate change is going to instigate societal change, societal conflict, population migration, scarce resources, food problems, and those generate conflict. Those are at least our potential to generate conflict, and that's going to change where we might be called on to intervene, what we might be called on to do. So that is the other aspect, I think, in terms of what it does to the world security situation when you inject that kind of new instability into the world, is to climate change that not everybody in the world can move, right, to accommodate climate change, so it's going to create conflict.
You anticipated another part of the question, but I'm going to ask a third part. Is there anybody you know of in DOD going back through the Trump administration, the Obama administration, go back pretty far, at least 10, 15 years, who doesn't think that climate change poses a significant risk to the U.S. military?
I have not heard any senior civilian or military leader say that the issue is not there.
Thank you. I want to move on to the question of the audit. And, you know, I think everybody would like to see the Pentagon have a comprehensive, clean audit every year. But it seems to me, having been involved in the private sector with some audits over the years, that auditing $700+ billion is not something that is easily done, no matter how well-intentioned the leadership of the Pentagon and the auditors would be. So this is kind of one of those, let us help you, help us help you questions. And that is, are we expecting too much out of when we talk about an audit of the Pentagon, or is there a way we can require it to be done that's helpful but not as difficult to do? Because it seems to me that if you're using normal standards for an audit where you have to take inventory of every bullet and every piece of equipment that you have and do appraisals of real estate values and all of the things that you would normally do, I don't know how in the world you could get it done on a timely basis.
Chairman, thank you for that question. I would say that I understand why it's expected of us. It's the law in the CFO Act. Other agencies do it, and it's a reasonable expectation of we should be able to do it too, despite our size and complexity. As you know, if we were our own country, our budget would put us in about the 30th country biggest in the world in terms of GDP, so we're an enormous operation, and we not only have to audit a $700 billion annual budget, we have $3 trillion in assets, and it's really on the balance sheet side that there's one thing that I think would be that we could get there much faster with the least damage to the public interest would be if we didn't have to do the balance sheet part of the audit, but we're doing the other parts of an audit, because valuing all our property has been an enormous challenge for us. Whereas, for example, 40% of our budget approximately is on the people side, is pay and benefits of our troops. We have clean opinions on all the processes that pay our military, pay our civilians, pay our retirees, which is exactly what my boss, the secretary, would want, you know, taking care of people. We are not messing that up. But on the trillions of dollars of assets that we have, accounting for it and valuing it is where we're struggling, as well as on the IT systems. But we should not be getting a pass on the IT system side, because as we see every day with the increasing degree of cyber threats, that if you don't have secure systems, you have other problems besides not passing the audit, right? So that is something where I think we definitely have a lot of work to do that we need to do. But on what I would call the balance sheet side, I'm not sure that the payoff for the taxpayers is really there, because if I can take one more minute on this, I know you know this, but it's easy to maybe for not everyone to understand it, that passing a financial audit means your obligations on the financial side are being matched with all your contracting decisions. It doesn't mean that the airplane that you bought was the right airplane, that it performs well, that you paid a fair price for it. There's any number of things that people are rightly concerned about in terms of that might be called waste or fraud or poor use of money, that passing an audit does not prevent and is not designed to prevent. It's matching up your numbers, but it still doesn't guarantee that you made wise decisions. And I know you know that, but that is just the other caveat I make. It is still worth doing, and it is the law. But I think again on the balance sheet side, I'm not sure that people at the end of the day will find the payoff is really there.
I appreciate that answer. One quick question before I go. I may have asked you this before, but I'm not. I remember meeting with a group of from the War College, and one of the things I asked them was, do you all think a lot about, this is probably 3 years ago, it was before pre-pandemic because they were in the office, and so do you all think a lot about how artificial intelligence is affecting the military and will? And their eyes all opened up, and one of them said, we talk about it all the time. I don't think there will ever be a strategic decision or tactical decision on a battlefield made again without artificial intelligence. And I asked the question because I'm curious as to how much money is being spent on researching how artificial intelligence can enhance our military operations and whether that's a high priority.
It is a high priority. In terms of how much is in the budget, it's a hard question to answer because like software, it's not in everything yet, but it's in many things and it's getting in more programs. It's part of more programs every day. I would say something that we kind of put our arms around, think about the $2 billion range right now, but the importance is growing rapidly. I would say along with quantum computing, it is one of two sort of foundational technological changes that we're looking in the national security world, not just the defense world, but the national security world. I think you are correct that man-machine teaming is already here and is going to grow. I know people sometimes focus on something that's entirely autonomous. We are not going to be quick to take the person out of the loop, I think, in terms of, especially in terms of the use of lethal force. But the man-machine teaming and the speed of decision-making, it's already here and it's growing. It is a huge interest item of our Deputy Secretary, who serves as our COO, basically. And there are a number of efforts that we've had to increase the use of AI out in the combatant commands, where we're sort of processing in real-time current operations, but also on the back end in the Pentagon in terms of decision-making processes. So we're looking at sort of both the business side and the operational side of AI, and she has created a new office, the Chief Digital and AI Office, to bring together some of these areas that were sort of in different places in terms of a focus on AI and how it affects our abilities. Again, the secretary, obviously is focused on this too, but the Deputy Secretary particularly has this sort of for an action item under the Secretary as to how we can really be much more agile than we are today in terms of information flows. I think there are areas where we have incredible situational awareness and real-time awareness, but AI is just increasing the need to speed your decision making, and that is something that we're very focused on, how to get better at that, because it is clearly foundational for the future.
Great. Well, I appreciate that answer. My time has expired. So I thank you again for coming before the committee today to present the President's DoD budget, and appreciate your responses. And if there's no further business, this hearing is adjourned.